My name is Nia Washington. I am 33 years old and the CEO of a wealth management firm in Chicago. But all the money and success in the world meant absolutely nothing when I woke up in a hospital trauma bay, my body crushed from a violent car accident, begging my own mother to come watch my 5-week-old baby. Her response was not panic or tears or a desperate rush to be by my side. It was pure annoyance because my near-fatal emergency was interrupting her champagne toast before my sister boarded a luxury cruise to Monaco. She told me to figure it out myself and hung up. Lying in that hospital bed, bleeding and broken, I made a decision that would destroy the perfect facade my family had built on my dime. I hired a private caregiver for my son and instantly cut off the $7,000 a month I had been blindly sending my parents for 6 years. Almost $500,000 gone in a heartbeat. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to toxic family members who only loved you for what you could provide. The first thing I registered was the blinding glare of fluorescent lights stabbing through my eyelids. Then came the smell, a sharp and sterile mixture of bleach and metallic copper that coated the back of my throat. I tried to lift my hands to shield my eyes, but a searing and white-hot agony ripped through my right shoulder, forcing a guttural scream from my lungs. The pain was absolute and suffocating. It radiated down my spine and pulsed behind my temples with the rhythmic and agonizing beat of a mild concussion. Stay still, Miss Washington. You are in the trauma bay at Chicago General Hospital. A voice floated somewhere above me, calm and highly authoritative. I forced my eyes open, blinking against the harsh lighting until the blurry silhouette of a doctor came into focus. He was shining a penlight into my pupils, his face a mask of clinical concentration. The memory of the last hour hit me like a physical blow. The screech of tires, the shattering of glass, the red light runner in the massive pickup truck plowing directly into the passenger side of my heavy SUV, Malik. The name tore from my throat, raw and desperate. My 5-week-old son had been in the back seat. Panic cold and entirely primal, completely overrode the pain of my fractured collarbone. I tried to thrash against the hospital bed rails, fighting the IV lines taped to my arm, demanding to know exactly where my baby was. The doctor pressed a firm hand against my uninjured shoulder, his voice loud enough to cut through my rising hysteria. "Your son is fine. He is perfectly safe." Those words were the only things keeping me tethered to reality in that moment. The doctor quickly explained that my premium car seat had done its job perfectly. Malik did not have a single scratch on his fragile little body. He was currently in the pediatric observation ward, sleeping soundly while the nurses monitored his vitals, just to be absolutely certain. The relief that washed over me was so profound it made me dizzy. My baby was alive. He was safe. I collapsed back into the stiff hospital pillows, tears of pure gratitude sliding down my temples and pooling in my ears. However, the doctor continued, his tone shifting to something much more serious. "Your injuries are significant. You have a severely fractured collarbone that requires immediate orthopedic surgery to pin the bone back into place. You also have a concussion and deep tissue bruising. You are going to be in the operating room for a few hours, and then you will be heavily medicated in recovery. Hospital protocol dictates that we cannot keep an uninjured infant in the pediatric ward indefinitely without a guardian present. We need you to call a family member to come and take custody of Malik while you are in surgery. If we cannot secure a temporary guardian, we will be forced by state law to contact Child Protective Services to watch him until you are deemed medically competent." The mere mention of Child Protective Services sent a fresh spike of adrenaline through my veins. There was absolutely no way I was letting my newborn son enter the system even for a few hours. I needed to call my parents. It was the only logical choice. I grabbed my personal belongings bag that the nurses had placed on the bedside table and fished out my phone. The screen was cracked from the intense impact of the crash, but it still turned on. My relationship with my parents, Calvin and Valerie, had always been highly transactional and distant. Growing up, I was the quiet and hardworking daughter who handled her own problems, while my younger sister Jasmine was the undisputed golden child. Jasmine was the center of their universe, the beautiful and charismatic daughter who commanded all their attention, while I was simply expected to succeed quietly and provide for the family when asked. But surely I thought a near-fatal car crash and their infant grandson needing a guardian would bridge whatever emotional gap existed between us. They were my parents. This was a life-or-death emergency. They would drop everything and rush to the hospital immediately. I found my mother inside my contacts and pressed call. The phone rang 3 times before she finally picked up. "What is it, Nia? I am incredibly busy right now." Valerie spoke with a voice that was sharp and heavily laced with irritation. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not even say a proper hello. Through the phone speaker, I could hear a loud cacophony of background noise, the clinking of crystal glasses, upbeat jazz music, and the unmistakable echoing voice of an airport intercom announcing a final boarding call. "Mom," I gasped, my voice trembling as a fresh wave of pain radiated from my broken collarbone. "I have been in a car accident. My car was hit at an intersection. I am at Chicago General Hospital. I am hurt pretty badly, and they need to take me into surgery right now." There was a brief pause on the line. I waited for the sudden gasp of horror, the frantic questions about my physical condition, the immediate promise that she was on her way to me. Instead, I heard her sigh loudly, the exact kind of exaggerated sigh a person makes when they are inconvenienced by a telemarketer. "Nia, are you serious right now?" Valerie demanded, her voice dropping to a harsh and scolding whisper. "Do you have any idea where I am today?" "I am in the trauma center, Mom." I sobbed, clutching the phone tighter against my ear. "I need you to come to the hospital. Malik is here. He is physically okay, but the hospital will not let him stay in the pediatric ward while I am under anesthesia. The doctor said if a family member does not come to claim him, they have to call Child Protective Services. Please, I just need you to come watch him for a few hours." "I cannot do that, Nia. It is entirely out of the question." The flat and unyielding rejection hit me harder than the heavy impact of the pickup truck. I blinked at the ceiling, my concussion-addled brain struggling to fully process her terrible words. "What do you mean you cannot do that?" I asked, my voice cracking from the sheer emotional shock. "It is a medical emergency." "It is, poor planning is what it is," Valerie snapped. "I am currently sitting in the VIP first-class lounge at the airport. Jasmine and Darius are celebrating their 3rd wedding anniversary today. They are flying first class to Europe for a luxury yacht cruise around Monaco. Your father and I are here seeing them off, and we are right in the middle of a special champagne toast. I am not leaving the airport and ruining your sister and her special day, just because you got into a fender bender." I lay there in stunned silence, the sterile smell of the trauma bay suddenly making me nauseous. My sister was going on a lavish vacation, and my mother was refusing to leave an airport lounge to rescue her 5-week-old grandson from being handed over to the state. It was so monstrously callous that I could not even formulate a coherent response. "Mom, my collarbone is broken in 3 places." I pleaded, abandoning my pride completely in a desperate attempt to reach her maternal instincts. "I could have died today. Malik needs his grandmother. Please just take a cab to the hospital. You can still see Jasmine off before you leave." "Stop being so incredibly dramatic, Nia." Valerie scoffed, the cheerful clinking of glasses continuing in her background. "You are always creating messes and expecting everyone else to stop their lives to clean them up. Look at Jasmine. She lives a flawless life. She never asks us to deal with these kinds of frustrating emergencies. Her husband is a highly successful entrepreneur, and they are living the dream. You chose to be a single mother working yourself to the bone. You chose to drive yourself around with a newborn instead of hiring a proper driver. We are boarding the flight now. Figure it out yourself." The line went dead. I pulled the cracked phone away from my ear and stared blankly at the dark screen. The dial tone buzzed loudly in the quiet of the trauma bay, a harsh and mechanical sound that perfectly matched the sudden emptiness expanding in my chest. She hung up on me. My mother had just left me and her newborn grandson, stranded in a busy emergency room to protect a fancy champagne toast. In that brief and devastating moment of absolute silence, the lifelong illusion of my family completely shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I had spent my entire adult life working 70-hour weeks building my wealth management firm from the ground up, trying desperately to earn their basic respect and love. I had faithfully paid their bills, managed their complicated taxes, and funded their comfortable lifestyle, always foolishly hoping that one day they would look at me with the exact same adoration they so freely gave to Jasmine. But the brutal truth was staring me right in the face, illuminated clearly by the harsh hospital lights. They did not love me. They never did. I was nothing but an automated teller machine to them, a highly convenient bank account they could endlessly drain to fund their toxic delusions of high society grandeur. The tears stopped instantly. The rising panic that had been suffocating my lungs evaporated rapidly, replaced by a cold, sharp, and terrifyingly clear focus. If I was nothing but a bank account to them, then the bank was officially permanently closed. I flagged down the nearest available trauma nurse, completely ignoring the agonizing pain shooting through my shoulder. My voice was no longer trembling or weak. It was steady and hard as forged steel. "I need exactly 5 minutes before you take me into the operating room," I told her. "I need to make some very important financial and personal arrangements." The nurse looked incredibly hesitant, but nodded clearly, sensing the absolute determination radiating from my broken body. I opened the web browser on my phone and quickly pulled up the private contact information for a premium concierge medical service my firm frequently used for our high net worth clients. I did not need my mother to save my son. I had immense resources she could only dream of possessing. The real tragedy was not that she abandoned me in my darkest hour. The real tragedy was what she was about to lose because of it. My fingers moved across the cracked glass of my phone screen with absolute precision. The suffocating panic tight in my chest was gone. The betrayal I just experienced had burned away all the vulnerable parts of my heart, leaving behind only the calculating mind of a chief executive officer. I found the emergency hotline for Sterling Medical Concierge, an elite private service my firm kept on retainer. The operator answered on the first ring, her voice crisp and highly professional. I identified myself using my corporate account number and issued my demands with absolute clarity. I told the operator I needed a fully vetted, board-certified pediatric nurse deployed to the trauma ward of Chicago General Hospital immediately. I specified that this nurse must have a background in high-security private care, and they were to remain by my 5-week-old son, Malik, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. The operator informed me this emergency deployment cost $1,500 a day, payable immediately. That was absolutely nothing compared to the safety of my child. Within 4 minutes, the contract was signed, the funds were verified, and a pediatric specialist was speeding toward the hospital. I lowered the phone, looking at the trauma nurse beside my bed. Her previous pity was replaced by stark, professional respect. I informed her my private nurse would arrive in exactly 20 minutes with elite credentials. I explicitly instructed her to update the hospital security desk immediately. Under no circumstances was anyone from my biological family allowed access to Malik. I gave them the names Valerie and Calvin Washington, making it clear that if either showed up, security was to treat them as hostile trespassers and escort them off the premises. The nurse nodded quickly, noting the directives on my chart. I felt a sharp jolt of pain radiate from my shattered collarbone, but I ignored it. I asked the nurse to hand me my iPad from my leather tote. Propping the iPad against my uninjured thigh, I logged into my firm's banking portal. The facial recognition software scanned my face, granting me immediate access to the master accounts. As the financial dashboard loaded, my eyes zeroed in on the scheduled external transfers tab. There it was. The parasitic drain on my life's work, neatly categorized under the label of medical support. 6 years ago, my father Calvin had sat me down in his living room, clutching his chest and weeping uncontrollably. He told me his heart was failing, that his insurance would not cover the experimental medications and specialized cardiac therapy he desperately needed to stay alive. He played on my deepest fears, manipulating the dutiful daughter who always craved his validation. I had immediately set up a recurring wire transfer of $7,000 every single month to cover his supposed medical bills. I never questioned it. I never asked to see the invoices. I just paid it month after month, year after year, believing I was keeping my father alive. The aggregate total glared back at me. $420,000. Nearly $500,000 of my hard-earned money siphoned away while my mother complained about my career choices and mocked my status as a single mother. They took my money to fund their illusions of grandeur while treating me like an embarrassing secret. They took my money and then refused to take a 15-minute cab ride to ensure my newborn son did not end up in the custody of the state. I felt a dark sense of closure as I hovered my finger over the cancellation icon. With one firm tap, I terminated the recurring wire transfer. A prompt appeared asking to confirm the permanent cancellation of the scheduled payment. I tapped it a second time. The screen refreshed, confirming the transfer was successfully deleted. But I was not finished. My parents also held supplementary black credit cards tied directly to my primary corporate account. Valerie loved to flash that heavy metal card at church luncheons and high society charity galas, pretending it was funded by Calvin's successful investments rather than my grueling 70-hour workweeks. I navigated to the card management menu. I selected Valerie's card, first hitting the deactivate button and selecting the option for suspected fraudulent activity. I did the exact same thing for Calvin's card. With 3 final taps on the glass screen, the financial lifeline they had abused for over half a decade was permanently severed. They were cut off, completely and utterly cut off. No more luxury dinners on my dime. No more designer suits paid for by my sweat. No more funding their perfect golden child daughter Jasmine while they left me bleeding in a hospital bed. I locked the iPad and handed it back to the trauma nurse just as the surgical team arrived to wheel me away. The anesthesiologist introduced himself, preparing the intravenous line that would finally grant me relief from the excruciating physical pain of my fractured collarbone. As the heavy, warm sensation of the medication began to flood my veins, pulling me down into a deep and dreamless sleep, I knew my son was guarded by a highly paid professional, and my assets were completely locked down. I woke up hours later in a private recovery suite. The room was incredibly quiet, save for the rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor next to my bed. My right shoulder was heavily bandaged and completely immobilized in a brace, but the sharp, stabbing agony had been replaced by a dull, throbbing ache. Sitting in a comfortable armchair near the window was the pediatric nurse I had hired from Sterling Medical Concierge. She smiled warmly, introducing herself and confirming that Malik was resting comfortably and securely in the adjacent private nursery attached to my suite. She assured me the security protocols were firmly in place, and no unauthorized personnel had attempted to approach him. I thanked her, my voice raspy and dry, and reached for my cracked phone resting on the bedside table. I pressed the power button, bringing the shattered screen to life. It had been approximately 45 minutes since I had officially cut them off financially, and the digital fallout was absolutely spectacular. My lock screen was entirely buried under a massive avalanche of urgent notifications. The first alert was a push notification from my banking app. Transaction declined. O'Hare International Airport, 5IP First Class Lounge, amount attempted $2,000. Valerie had clearly tried to cover the cost of upgrading Jasmine and Darius to an ultra-exclusive luxury suite before their flight to Monaco, only to have the metal black card humiliate her by declining right in front of the airline concierge. Following that single beautiful notification was a relentless stream of digital panic. I had 45 missed calls, all from my mother. Her name filled my recent call log, a desperate and repetitive block of red text that painted a vivid picture of her escalating hysteria. Alongside the missed calls were dozens of frantic text messages. The first few messages were demanding and entitled, commanding me to call the bank immediately because my card was malfunctioning and embarrassing her in front of highly important people. But as the minutes ticked by and the reality of the situation began to set in, the tone of the texts drastically shifted. The arrogance quickly morphed into wild, furious accusations. She demanded to know if I had locked the accounts out of spite. She accused me of being a bitter and jealous sister, trying to ruin Jasmine's beautiful anniversary trip just because I was miserable and alone in a hospital bed. I scrolled slowly through the wall of frantic text messages, savoring every single word of her unhinged panic. She called me an ungrateful daughter. She threatened to tell our church congregation about my wicked behavior. She even sent a massive paragraph detailing how Darius was highly offended that his celebratory champagne toast was interrupted by her declined card. Her sheer audacity only solidified my absolute certainty that I made the correct choice. I did not reply to a single message. I did not type out an angry response or attempt to explain my actions. I simply swiped the notifications away, clearing my screen with a calm and deliberate motion. I opened my email and sent a brief, heavily encrypted message to my lead corporate attorney and my personal private investigator. I instructed them to initiate a full, deep-dive background check on Darius and his supposed high-yield investment firm. Their sudden rush to flee the country for a luxury trip to Monaco felt suspicious. Desperation always leaves a sloppy paper trail, and I was going to find every single dirty secret they were hiding. I locked my phone and set it back on the nightstand, resting my head against the hospital pillows. While the private nurse quietly tended to Malik in the adjoining nursery, the post-operative pain began to flare up with an absolute vengeance. The anesthesia was wearing off rapidly, leaving my fractured collarbone screaming with every shallow breath I took. A floor nurse stepped into my recovery suite holding a small plastic cup and a syringe, offering a heavy dose of intravenous painkillers to help me sleep through the worst of the trauma. I held up my uninjured hand and firmly declined. I could not afford the luxury of a clouded mind or lethargic reactions. The betrayal I had just experienced required absolute mental clarity, and I needed my brain as sharp as a scalpel for what I was about to do. Reluctantly, the nurse backed away, recording my refusal on my medical chart before quietly exiting the room. I reached for my iPad again, ignoring the sharp spike of agony that shot down my spine with the sudden movement. Propping the device carefully on my lap, I logged directly into the highest security tier of my firm's back-end server. As the chief executive officer of a premier wealth management and accounting firm, I had unrestricted access to the complete financial profiles of every single client we serviced. And since I had taken over my parents' financial management a decade ago to save them accounting fees, their entire economic existence resided right at my fingertips. I opened Calvin and Valerie Washington's master tax profiles and requested a full aggregate report of their spending deductions and asset transfers over the last 6 years. The system took a few seconds to compile the data, generating a massive spreadsheet of incoming wires, outgoing payments, and itemized tax deductions. I immediately navigated to their medical expenditure category. If my father truly had a deteriorating heart condition that required $7,000 a month in experimental medications and specialized cardiac therapy, there would be a massive and unavoidable paper trail. There would be insurance deductibles, co-payments out-of-pocket maximums, and extensive billing records from top-tier cardiology clinics. I scrolled down the digital ledger, my eyes scanning the heavily populated rows of financial data. The medical expense column stared back at me with staggering clarity. Zero. There was absolutely zero medical debt. There were no payments to any specialized cardiac units anywhere in the state. There were no experimental pharmaceutical charges. The only medical deductions listed over the entire 6-year period were standard co-payments for routine dental cleanings and basic annual physicals. My father did not have a heart condition. He was perfectly healthy. The tears he cried in my living room, the desperate pleas for financial help to save his life, it was all an elaborate and disgusting fabrication designed entirely to drain my bank accounts. My breathing grew shallow as I switched tabs, tracing the exact destination of the $420,000 I had faithfully wired them. The money hit their primary checking account and was almost immediately funneled out into 3 distinct directions. I followed the first massive financial artery straight into an account jointly owned by Jasmine and Darius. My supposedly independent and highly successful brother-in-law was not funding his own lavish lifestyle. My hard-earned money had been used to cover the massive down payment on Darius's custom red Porsche 911. The loan documents were right there on the screen, heavily subsidized by regular cash injections from my parents. The second financial artery led directly to high-end retail boutiques and luxury department stores. I pulled up the itemized receipts. Tens of thousands of dollars had been carelessly swiped away on Jasmine's extensive designer wardrobe. The red-bottom shoes, the limited edition handbags, the custom-tailored dresses my sister constantly flaunted on her social media profiles to maintain her flawless image were all paid for by my grueling 70-hour work weeks. They were literally wearing the money I thought was keeping my father alive. But the final destination of my stolen funds was perhaps the most sickening discovery of all. I pulled up my parents' charitable contribution forms. Valerie and Calvin had been claiming massive tax-deductible tithes to our local Baptist church. They were dropping exorbitant amounts of cash into the offering plate every single Sunday. They used my money to essentially purchase the title of the most generous, elite, and affluent Black family in their entire congregation. They sat in the front pews, soaking up the admiration and respect of their peers, masquerading as high society philanthropists, while secretly bleeding their eldest daughter dry. They bought their fake prestige with the sweat off my back. I sat there in the sterile silence of my hospital room, staring at the cold, hard numbers illuminating my iPad screen. Any residual daughterly guilt I might have been harboring evaporated in an instant. The tiny voice inside my head that wondered if I had been too harsh by cutting off their credit cards was permanently silenced. The profound sadness of being abandoned at the airport vanished, instantly incinerated by a sudden and overwhelming inferno of pure, calculated rage. This was not simply a case of parents favoring one child over another. This was active, malicious, and highly calculated exploitation. I vividly remembered the early days of building my firm. I remembered the nights I skipped dinner because I needed to make payroll for my first 2 employees. I remembered missing out on social events, vacations, and simple moments of joy because I was terrified that if I did not work hard enough, I would not be able to send my father his monthly medical fund. I had sacrificed my youth and my peace of mind to save a man who was actively laughing behind my back. My family had weaponized my loyalty and weaponized my love. They transformed my deepest fears into a funding mechanism for my sister's perfect illusion. A terrifying sense of calm settled over my battered body. The pain in my shoulder faded into the background, overshadowed by the intense and surgical precision of my fury. I locked my iPad and placed it carefully on the rolling hospital tray beside my bed. I smoothed down the edges of my hospital gown and adjusted my posture, sitting up as straight as my broken collarbone would allow. I did not shed a single tear. Crying was for victims, and I was no longer a victim. I was a CEO, an accountant, and a mother who had just caught her biggest embezzlers red-handed. I turned my gaze toward the heavy wooden double doors of my recovery suite and simply waited. Less than 20 minutes later, the heavy doors to my room were violently thrown open, crashing loudly against the wall stops. The sudden noise echoed like a gunshot through the quiet ward. Valerie marched into the room first, her face twisted into an ugly mask of pure, unadulterated fury. She was wearing a flawless silk pantsuit and oversized designer sunglasses pushed back onto her head. The overwhelming scent of her expensive perfume instantly clashed with the sterile smell of hospital bleach. Right behind her stomped Calvin, his face red and a deep scowl etched into his features. Jasmine and Darius trailed closely behind them, effectively blocking the doorway. The visual contrast between us was stark and almost comical. I was lying in a hospital bed hooked up to heart monitors, my arms strapped into a heavy medical brace, my face pale and bruised from a horrific car crash. They were dressed for a Mediterranean luxury cruise, dragging 4 massive pieces of monogrammed Louis Vuitton luggage right into the middle of a sterile orthopedic recovery room. The heavy wheels of their suitcases squeaked aggressively across the linoleum floor, completely shattering the peace of the hospital environment. Nobody brought flowers. Nobody rushed to my bedside to check my bandages. Nobody asked the nurse standing in the adjacent doorway if my 5-week-old son was safe. The concept of my physical survival was not even an afterthought in their minds. Their eyes darted wildly around the room, not looking for injuries, but looking for someone to blame for their massive inconvenience. The loving family facade they projected to the world in their church congregation was completely stripped away, revealing the greedy and selfish parasites lurking underneath. Valerie marched directly to the foot of my hospital bed and slammed her manicured hands down onto the plastic railing. She glared at me, her chest heaving with exertion and rage. "You have completely lost your mind, Nia," she shrieked, her voice echoing loudly down the hospital corridor. "Do you have any idea the kind of absolute humiliation you just put me through?" The entire first-class lounge watched my card get declined. The airline staff looked at me like I was some kind of broke street beggar. "You need to call your bank and fix this computer glitch right now. We have a flight to catch in exactly 2 hours." Jasmine stepped around her mother, dramatically dropping the handle of her expensive suitcase. Her face was twisted into a petulant pout, resembling a spoiled toddler rather than a 30-year-old married woman. "You are being so incredibly petty right now, Nia," Jasmine whined, crossing her arms over her chest. "This is my third anniversary trip. Darius has incredibly important meetings in Monaco, and you are ruining everything just because you are jealous. You are acting completely unhinged over a minor car accident. You need to unlock the accounts right now before we miss our yacht departure." Calvin stood silently behind his wife and golden child, his arms crossed over his chest, his perfectly healthy heart beating steadily. He looked at me with cold disappointment, using the exact same expression he used to manipulate me into funding his fake illness. I looked at the four of them, taking in their expensive clothes, their shiny luggage, and their absolute lack of human empathy. My son was sleeping in the next room, and these people were screaming about declined credit cards and luxury yachts. I kept my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not raise my voice. I did not match their hysterical energy. I looked directly into my father's eyes and prepared to deliver the reality check they so desperately needed. Valerie did not even pause to draw a breath. She completely ignored the massive sling holding my fractured collarbone together and the heavy bandages wrapped tightly around my chest. Her eyes were fixed entirely on her own bruised ego. She paced the length of my hospital bed, waving her deactivated black card in the air like a weapon. "Do you comprehend the level of embarrassment I just endured?" she shrieked, her voice bouncing off the sterile walls of the recovery suite. The airline representative practically sneered at me when the machine beeped declined. I had to step out of line like a common criminal. I promised the pastor a generous donation from Monaco to support the new sanctuary fund, and now you have frozen my assets over a bruised shoulder. Jasmine stepped up right beside her, stomping her designer heel against the linoleum. "We are going to miss the transfer shuttle to the marina, Nia," Jasmine whined, gesturing frantically toward her pile of expensive luggage. "Do you know how hard it was to secure this specific yacht reservation? It is our third anniversary. You are ruining a once-in-a-lifetime celebration because you could not bother to drive carefully. You always try to steal my spotlight. Even now, you had to throw yourself into a hospital bed just to ruin my trip. You need to call your wealth management team right now and override the fraud alert before we lose our deposit." That was when Darius finally stepped out from behind the towering stack of Louis Vuitton bags. He puffed out his chest, adjusting the cuffs of his tailored blazer, trying to project the aura of a high-powered executive. He walked right up to the side of my bed, intentionally invading my personal space in an aggressive attempt at physical intimidation. His expensive cologne washed over me, thick and cloying. He leaned over the plastic bed rails, his face inches from mine, and lowered his voice into a demanding and authoritative register. "Listen to me very closely," Nia, Darius said, narrowing his eyes. "I do not have time for these petty sisterly squabbles. I have extremely high net worth investors waiting to meet me in Monaco. We are talking about multi-million-dollar venture capital deals that require my immediate presence. I cannot afford to look like a fool in front of international financiers because my sister-in-law is throwing a temper tantrum over a minor traffic accident. I need you to unlock those accounts right this second. Hand me your iPad and authorize the international clearance immediately. My entire business reputation is on the line, and I will not let your selfish behavior sabotage my investor relations." I did not flinch. I did not shrink back into the pillows. I stared directly into Darius's eyes, holding his aggressive gaze with absolute chilling stillness. The silence in the room stretched out thick and suffocating as I let his ridiculous demands hang in the air. Finally, I turned my attention away from the scammer and locked eyes with my father. Calvin was still standing near the door, wearing his tailored golf slacks, looking completely healthy and vibrant. "Dad's heart medication fund is dry," I said. My voice was incredibly calm, yet the words sliced through the room like a freshly sharpened blade. The entire room went completely silent. Valerie froze, her deactivated credit card dropping to her side. Jasmine stopped complaining about the yacht. Darius stepped back from the bed, his arrogant posture instantly dissolving into rigid panic. Calvin's face drained of color, his eyes widening as the reality of my statement hit him. You have drained $420,000 from me over the last 6 years. I continued enunciating every single syllable with razor-sharp clarity. $420,000, Dad. I sat in this very hospital bed bleeding from a car accident and audited your entire financial profile. I saw the bank records. I saw the itemized tax deductions. There is no failing heart. There are no specialized cardiac therapies. There are no experimental medications keeping you alive. Your medical expenses are absolutely zero. I shifted my gaze to my sister, who was suddenly looking very pale. But I did see exactly where my hard-earned money went, I told them. I saw the massive wire transfers paying for the down payment on Darius's custom red Porsche. I saw the tens of thousands of dollars funneled into Jasmine's designer wardrobe. I saw the enormous, ridiculous tithes Mom has been dumping into the local Baptist church just to maintain your grand illusion as the neighborhood's elite affluent black family. You took my money, the money I worked 70-hour weeks to earn, and you used it to bankroll a fake high society lifestyle. Valerie's face flushed a deep, violent shade of crimson when I mentioned the church tithes. She had built her entire identity around being the most prominent socialite in our congregation. The fact that I knew her religious generosity was entirely funded by stolen money struck a massive blow to her fragile ego. You keep the church out of your filthy mouth, Valerie hissed, taking a threatening step toward the bed. That money was a blessing given to the Lord. You should be thanking me for securing your spiritual salvation with those tithes, considering the sinful unwed lifestyle you are currently living. The absolute delusion required to justify grand theft as a religious blessing was genuinely staggering. I looked at all four of them, letting the sheer weight of their deception settle over them. You lied to me for 6 years. You manipulated my love and my loyalty to fund your luxury cars and your European cruises. And then when I was lying in a trauma bay, terrified that my 5-week-old son would be taken away by Child Protective Services, you refused to help me because it would interrupt your champagne toast. I paused, taking a slow, steady breath. From now on, you pay your own bills. The bank is permanently closed. For a long, agonizing moment, nobody moved. I watched their minds process the catastrophic reality that their unlimited funding was officially gone. I expected shame. I expected a frantic attempt at an apology. I expected my father to fall to his knees and beg for forgiveness for lying about a terminal heart condition. But I had severely underestimated the depths of their narcissism and entitlement. Instead of apologizing, they doubled down. The initial shock on Calvin's face rapidly warped into defensive, explosive fury. He stepped forward, pushing past Jasmine and Darius, his fists clenched tightly at his sides. How dare you speak to us like that? Calvin roared, his voice booming so loudly the heart monitor next to my bed spiked. We are your parents. We raised you. We put a roof over your head. You owe us everything you have. You think because you run some fancy wealth management firm that you can suddenly disrespect the people who brought you into this world? You are an ungrateful, bitter woman. Nia, Valerie chimed in, her voice dripping with venom. We took that money because we deserved it. You have millions sitting in your corporate accounts doing absolutely nothing. Why shouldn't your family enjoy the fruits of your labor? You are just trying to ruin your sister's happiness because you are miserable. Calvin pointed a heavy finger directly at my face, a gesture he had used to intimidate me since I was a small child. This is exactly why your child's father left you, he spat out, delivering the cruelest blow he could muster. You are a bitter single mother who cannot stand to see her sister in a happy, successful marriage. You are jealous of Jasmine. You have always been jealous of Jasmine. She has a loving husband, a beautiful life, and a perfect future. You are sitting here alone with a bastard child trying to destroy her anniversary out of pure malicious spite. Jasmine immediately played the victim, stepping behind her husband and burying her face in his shoulder. She is just trying to sabotage me. Darius, Jasmine sobbed loudly, performing for the room. She has always hated that you chose me. She wants to ruin your investor meeting so you lose your business. Please make her fix the cards. Darius glared at me, his jaw working furiously. This is a pathetic stunt, Nia, he sneered. You cannot just cut off your own family to prove a point. You are going to authorize the international clearance right now, or we are going to have a very serious problem. I am not playing games with my investors because you are throwing a postpartum pity party. You do not understand the mechanics of high-level finance, Nia. The venture capital world operates on optics. If I show up to the marina in Monaco with a declined credit card, my investors will walk away from a $10 million tech deal. You are literally jeopardizing my entire corporate infrastructure. I will pay you back the $400,000 when the deal closes, but you have to release the funds right now. I let out a harsh, humorless laugh that caused my fractured collarbone to throb painfully. Pay me back? I asked, raising a single eyebrow. You cannot even afford the down payment on your own sports car, Darius. You are not a tech mogul. You are a grifter living off your sister-in-law's CPA firm. There are no investors waiting for you in Monaco. The only thing waiting for you is a luxury vacation you cannot afford. The insult hit Darius right in his pride. He lunged forward, grabbing the plastic railing of my hospital bed and shaking it violently. You better watch your mouth, he threatened, his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. You do not know who you are messing with. My private pediatric nurse, who had been standing silently by the nursery door, immediately stepped forward. She pressed a prominent red button on the wall and pulled out her radio. Security to Suite 400. We have a hostile individual threatening a patient, she stated clearly and professionally. Darius immediately backed away, holding his hands up in a mock gesture of surrender, though his eyes were completely murderous. Calvin slowly buttoned his suit jacket, his eyes locked onto the nursery door. The shift in his demeanor was chilling. The loud, blustering father was gone, replaced by a cold and calculating extortionist. He realized that the financial spigot was completely shut off, and appealing to my guilt was completely useless. He needed leverage. He needed something so valuable, so incredibly precious to me, that I would gladly surrender my entire empire just to protect it. You think you hold all the cards because you control the bank accounts, Calvin said, his voice dropping into a soft, menacing whisper that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. You think you can just lay in that bed, broken and alone, and dictate terms to the man who gave you life? You are very badly mistaken, Nia. You are highly emotional right now. You just suffered a severe head trauma. You are clearly not thinking straight. I watched him carefully, my muscles tensing involuntarily despite the pain. I am thinking perfectly clearly, I replied. We will see about that, Calvin said, turning his sinister gaze back to me. Because from where I am standing, I see an unwed single mother who just endured a major car crash. I see a woman suffering from severe post-concussion syndrome. I see a patient who is wildly hallucinating about stolen money and fake tax returns. And most importantly, I see an infant child who is currently in the care of a highly unstable and deeply paranoid woman. The sheer wickedness of his implication hung heavy in the sterile hospital air. My own father was laying the groundwork for a horrifying narrative. He was perfectly willing to brand me as a mentally unstable, unfit mother just to regain access to my wealth. The betrayal deepened, transforming from financial theft into a direct threat against my family of two. The confrontation had escalated far beyond stolen money. It was now a battle for my son. Calvin took another deliberate step toward my bed. He dropped the facade of the loving father. The man standing before me was a stranger, a ruthless predator who had finally taken off his mask. His eyes, usually warm and inviting when he was putting on a show for his church congregation, were now dead and empty. The private nurse shifted uncomfortably near the doorway, her hand still resting on her security radio, but Calvin completely ignored her presence. He was weaponizing my physical vulnerability, exploiting the fact that I was strapped to a hospital bed, shattered and bleeding. You listen to me, and you listen to me very carefully, Calvin whispered, his voice dangerously low and smooth. You love reminding everyone that you built your little empire all by yourself. But right now, you are nothing but a broken woman in a hospital gown. You cannot even sit up without a massive dose of painkillers. You are physically weak, Nia. You are completely and utterly powerless. And I am the man who brought you into this world, which means I can easily take everything you have built right out of your hands." The absolute malice in his tone was staggering. This was a hostile corporate takeover executed right in the trauma recovery wing of a hospital. Valerie stood behind him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, nodding in silent agreement with every single cruel word he delivered. She looked at me, not with a mother's profound love, but with the cold calculation of a ruthless creditor waiting to collect a debt. Calvin leaned even closer, his dark eyes narrowing into predatory slits. "Let me paint a very clear picture for you," he continued, his tone dripping with venomous authority and absolute conviction. "You are an unmarried mother. You do not have a dedicated husband to protect you or advocate for you in a court of law. You just survived a major collision that resulted in a highly documented head trauma. You are currently refusing medication, acting highly paranoid, and making wild, unsubstantiated accusations about your loving family stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from your accounts. Do you know exactly what that looks like to the proper authorities, Nia? It looks exactly like a textbook case of severe postpartum psychosis. It looks like a deranged, brain-damaged woman who is a direct and immediate physical danger to her own helpless newborn infant." I felt a shockingly cold chill run rapidly down my entire spine. The sheer unprecedented evil of his strategic legal maneuver was genuinely paralyzing. He was fully preparing to use my actual injuries and my vulnerable status as a single mother to intentionally construct a devastating legal narrative against me. "If you do not unlock those bank accounts right this instant," Calvin threatened, aggressively pointing a thick finger directly at my bruised face, "I am going to pull out my cell phone and dial Child Protective Services. I will speak directly to the emergency duty worker. I will tell them with absolute parental concern that my eldest daughter has lost her fragile grip on reality after a traumatic brain injury. I will tell them that you are wildly hallucinating, that you are acting violently toward your family, and that we are absolutely terrified for the safety of baby Malik. The state will not hesitate to intervene, Nia. They will walk right into that nursery, pull your son out of his bassinet, and hand him over to the foster care system before you even have a chance to call a lawyer." The sheer audacity of his monstrous extortion sent a heavy wave of intense nausea rolling violently through my stomach. He was fully and completely prepared to throw his own flesh and blood into the foster care system just to get his greedy hands back on my credit cards. But Calvin was not finished outlining his deeply diabolical master plan. "And once Child Protective Services permanently removes Malik from your custody," he continued, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly practical and businesslike register, "your mother and I will generously step forward. We will play the perfect role of the devoted, affluent, and highly respectable grandparents. We will immediately petition the family court for emergency custody of our beloved grandson. The judge will look at our pristine suburban home, our perfect church attendance, and our flawless community reputation. They will grant us full custody without batting an eye." Valerie stepped forward, placing a perfectly manicured hand on Calvin's shoulder, willfully adding her own layer of psychological torture to the conversation. "And once we legally have Malik, Nia, we will have to protect his financial future," Valerie said, a wicked, triumphant smile playing on her lips. "Since you are clearly mentally unfit to care for your child, we will formally petition the state for a full binding conservatorship over your estate and your business. A judge will happily hand us the keys to your wealth management firm to ensure your son is properly provided for. We will legally drain you dry, and there will be absolutely nothing you can do to stop us. You will be locked away in a psychiatric facility while we live comfortably in our mansion raising your son." They had weaponized my powerful maternal instincts, my severe physical injuries, and the legal system itself to create a foolproof, inescapable trap. They were actively trying to back me into a dark corner where my only viable option was total and complete financial surrender. Calvin stood up straight, towering over my hospital bed, like a conquering dictator admiring his newly acquired territory. He adjusted the crisp lapels of his suit jacket and delivered his final vicious ultimatum. "Turn the accounts back on Nia. If you don't, you will leave this hospital without your son and without your company." He reached deep into his pocket and pulled out his expensive smartphone, unlocking the screen and navigating directly to the keypad. He held the phone up so I could see the screen clearly, fully ready to dial the emergency hotline for the state welfare department. "I am giving you exactly 1 hour to make your decision," Calvin stated coldly. His dark eyes locked onto mine with unwavering, absolute hostility. "You have 60 minutes to log back into your precious banking portal, reverse the fraud flags on your mother's credit cards, and authorize the international wire transfers so Jasmine and Darius can catch their luxury yacht in Monaco. If the money is not completely accessible the moment that hour expires, I will make the call. I will tell the authorities you are a profound danger to yourself and your baby, and I will gladly watch them carry Malik out of this hospital in the arms of a complete stranger." Jasmine huffed impatiently, aggressively checking the diamond-encrusted watch on her wrist. 1 hour, Nia Jasmine whined loudly. "Do not make us wait any longer than that. Darius is going to miss his highly important investor meeting, and I am not flying commercial just because you are being stubborn. Fix your mess so we can leave." Before I could even process a single response, the heavy hospital doors swung open again. 2 large security guards stepped into the room, rapidly responding to the silent panic button my private nurse had wisely pressed earlier. The guards instantly assessed the tense situation, firmly placing their hands on their utility belts as they stepped squarely between my family and my hospital bed. "Is there a problem here, ma'am?" the lead security officer asked, looking directly at me. Calvin immediately snapped back into his charismatic, charming persona. "There is no problem here at all, officers," Calvin said smoothly, raising his hands in a calm, placating gesture. "We are just a concerned family checking on our daughter after a terrible car accident. Emotions are running a little high today, but we were just leaving to give her some quiet time to rest and recover." I stared back at Calvin, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my fractured ribs, yet I refused to let him see the sheer terror gripping my soul. My father had truly shown me the darkest, most depraved corners of his insatiable greed. I remained completely silent, tightly gripping the stiff edge of my sterile hospital blanket, refusing to submit. Valerie grabbed her purse, glaring at me from behind the broad shoulders of the security guards. "Remember exactly what your father said, Nia," Valerie whispered, her tone heavily laced with pure poison. "You have exactly 1 hour to do the right thing for your family." Darius grabbed the handles of their monogrammed luggage, jerking the heavy bags roughly toward the main exit. The 4 of them turned in perfect synchronization and marched out of my hospital suite, their expensive shoes clicking loudly down the long hallway. They did not look back. They simply stormed out to the hospital cafeteria to sit comfortably with their coffee and wait for the clock to run out. The heavy wooden doors clicked completely shut, sealing me inside the sterile recovery room once again. The deafening silence that followed their departure was a stark and terrifying contrast to the absolute chaos they had just inflicted upon me. I let out a long, shuddering breath, forcing my racing heart to steady itself against the overwhelming surge of adrenaline. My private pediatric nurse immediately stepped forward from the shadowed corner of the room. Her expression was a mixture of professional shock and fierce protective instinct. She locked the main door from the inside and assured me the security detail outside had been doubled. She promised me that Malik was sleeping peacefully in the adjoining nursery, completely oblivious to the monstrous threats his grandfather had just leveled against our small family. I thanked her, my voice remarkably steady, despite the terror flooding my system. I did not have time to process the emotional devastation of my own father threatening to send my newborn into the foster care system. I could not afford to cry over the fact that my mother stood by and watched him do it. I had a 60-minute deadline. The clock was officially ticking, and I needed to deploy the nuclear option to protect my son and my empire. I reached for my phone with my good hand, ignoring the searing pain radiating from my shattered collarbone and the dull ache in my bruised ribs. I bypassed my standard contacts and dialed a highly secure unlisted number. My lead corporate attorney, Marcus, answered on the second ring. Marcus was a ruthless, brilliant legal shark who handled my firm's most complex litigation and personal security matters. I quickly conferenced in Vance, my personal private investigator. Vance was a former federal agent who specialized in forensic accounting, corporate espionage, and finding things people desperately wanted to keep hidden. When both men were on the line, I laid out the situation with cold, clinical precision. I informed them of Calvin's extortion attempt and his explicit threat to involve Child Protective Services using my medical condition as a weapon. Marcus swore softly under his breath and immediately began mobilizing a legal strike team. He initiated the drafting of emergency injunctions and prepared his associates to intercept any fraudulent claims filed with the family court. We established a firm, impenetrable legal perimeter. If Calvin even dialed the state authorities, Marcus had a team of attorneys ready to counterfile with documented evidence of extortion and a sworn statement from my attending physician confirming my complete mental competency. But my primary target was not my father. My primary target was the man who had sparked this entire confrontation. I instructed Vance to execute a massive emergency background check on my brother-in-law and his supposed high-yield investment firm. I told Vance that Darius was frantically trying to board a luxury yacht in Monaco today, which screamed of a sudden desperate flight risk. People running legitimate venture capital firms do not throw aggressive temper tantrums in hospital rooms over a frozen credit card. Darius was panicked, and panic always breeds fatal mistakes. I told Vance to follow the money tear apart Darius's corporate filings and find the absolute rot I knew was hiding underneath his tailored suits. Desperation leaves an incredibly sloppy paper trail, and I needed every single dirty detail delivered to my iPad before my father's 60-minute deadline expired. Vance did not ask unnecessary questions. He simply promised immediate results and disconnected to start the digital excavation. I ended the call and leaned back against the stiff hospital pillows. My fractured collarbone throbbed with a relentless burning ache, but I absolutely refused to call the nurse for medication. I needed my mind entirely sharp. The digital clock on the wall mocked me, counting down the minutes while my family sat downstairs casually sipping overpriced coffee and waiting for me to surrender everything I had worked my entire life to build. They genuinely thought they had trapped me. They thought my profound love for my newborn son would force me to capitulate and hand over the keys to my wealth. They fundamentally misunderstood the woman they had abused and exploited for decades. I was not going to surrender. I was going to systematically dismantle their entire lives. 42 agonizing minutes into the countdown, my iPad chimed with a highly encrypted email notification. Vance was incredibly fast, living up to his exorbitant retainer fee. I opened the message and used my facial recognition software to unlock the attached security dossier. The file was massive, containing hundreds of pages of bank records, shell company corporate filings, and red-flagged financial transactions. I skimmed past the executive summary and dove straight into the raw data regarding Darius and his supposedly elite venture capital firm. The ugly truth stared back at me in stark black and white, illuminating the iPad screen with undeniable criminality. Darius was not a tech entrepreneur. He was not managing international portfolios or securing millions in venture capital for emerging markets. He was running a massive, highly sophisticated affinity fraud operation. It was a classic Ponzi scheme, but it was specifically and maliciously targeted at the local African American community. Darius had leveraged his position as the husband of the golden child to infiltrate the very heart of my parents' affluent church congregation. He used Valerie's carefully cultivated reputation as a high society socialite and Calvin's status as a respected church elder to gain the absolute, unquestioning trust of the parishioners. The files detailed how he confidently promised elderly church members, hardworking families, and local small business owners massive returns on their investments. He took their life savings, their retirement accounts, their children's college funds, and their hard-earned cash, promising to invest it in exclusive high-yield technology startups. But there were no startups. There was no elite investment portfolio. Darius was simply using the incoming funds from new victims to pay off the older investors, keeping the fragile illusion afloat while skimming hundreds of thousands of dollars off the top. He used their stolen money to fund his designer suits, his luxury vehicles, and the lavish lifestyle Jasmine endlessly paraded on social media. The absolute betrayal went so much deeper than just stealing from me. They were stealing from vulnerable people who trusted them implicitly. Elderly widows who had known my parents for decades had handed over their meager pensions to Darius, entirely believing Calvin's glowing endorsements from the pulpit. Young couples trying to build generational wealth had been financially gutted by my sister's husband. And my parents, the people who sat in the front pew every Sunday singing hymns, had actively facilitated the entire slaughter. It made me physically sick to realize that the wealth I had built was tied into this nightmare. The entire Monaco anniversary trip was not a romantic celebration. It was a desperate, calculated escape plan. His scheme was finally collapsing under the weight of its own deception, and he was trying to flee the country before the authorities or his victims realized he had stolen millions from his own community. My hands shook with a potent mixture of disgust and vindication as I scrolled further down into the comprehensive forensic accounting report. Vance had meticulously cross-referenced Darius's fraudulent corporate accounts with my own financial ledgers. I needed to understand exactly how my father's fake heart medication fund tied into this massive criminal enterprise. The missing link was right there, buried in a convoluted web of shell companies and offshore accounts. The $7,000 a month I had been faithfully wiring to my parents for 6 years was not just funding luxury shopping sprees and extravagant church tithes. That money served a much darker, much more dangerous purpose. Valerie and Calvin knew exactly what Darius was doing. They knew their perfect son-in-law was a complete fraud. As Darius's Ponzi scheme began to inevitably crack, he had turned to aggressive, unregulated lenders to keep the cash flowing, and the older investors quiet. He owed massive sums of money to violent loan sharks who did not care about his church reputation or his expensive lifestyle. When those sharks started circling, threatening to expose the fraud resort to violence and destroy the golden couple's flawless image, Valerie stepped in. She used the money she extorted from me through my father's fake illness to pay off Darius's illicit debts. My mother had been taking my hard-earned money, laundering it through their personal checking accounts, and handing it directly to criminals just to protect Jasmine's fake high society lifestyle. They were entirely complicit in a multi-million-dollar fraud ring, and they had actively used my guilt and my love for my father to finance their criminal cover-up. The absolute depravity of their actions took my breath away. They had willingly bankrolled the destruction of their own church community, using my money, and now they were threatening to steal my son to keep their criminal enterprise alive. Valerie and Calvin were not just greedy parents favoring one daughter over another, they were active co-conspirators in a criminal syndicate. They had watched me work myself to the bone, watched me struggle as a single mother, and happily siphoned my accounts to keep their fraudulent empire from collapsing. And when the well ran dry, their immediate response was to threaten my infant son. The monstrous reality of who these people truly were settled into my bones, freezing any lingering emotional attachment I had left for them. The clock ticked down to the final 5 minutes of Calvin's vicious ultimatum. My phone remained silent. They were waiting for me to break. They were sitting in that cafeteria, utterly confident that my maternal terror would override my business sense. I locked my iPad, securing the explosive evidence behind military-grade encryption. I looked toward the nursery door, listening to the soft, rhythmic breathing of my baby boy over the monitor. They thought my love for Malik was my greatest weakness. They were about to find out it was the exact reason I was going to utterly destroy them. My fingers flew across the glass screen of my iPad as I dug deeper into the forensic accounting report Vance had provided. The initial shock of the Ponzi scheme had passed, leaving behind a cold, analytical precision. I needed to understand the exact timeline of their grand escape. I pulled up the travel itineraries my mother had foolishly booked using my corporate card before I deactivated it. The tickets were for a one-way trip to Monaco. I stared at the destination, letting the geographical reality wash over me. Monaco is a notoriously wealthy sovereign city-state, but it is also famous for something else entirely. It has highly complex and specific extradition treaties, particularly regarding white-collar financial crimes. The entire puzzle suddenly snapped together with breathtaking clarity. This was never an anniversary celebration. Darius was not flying across the Atlantic to meet with high-net-worth venture capitalists. He was fleeing the jurisdiction of the United States federal government. The walls were rapidly closing in on his massive affinity fraud operation. His aggressive loan sharks were demanding their money, and the elderly church members he had scammed were likely starting to ask very uncomfortable questions about their missing retirement funds. Darius knew federal indictments were coming. He knew the Securities and Exchange Commission would be knocking on his door at any moment. He was grabbing his wife, dragging his complicit mother-in-law along for the ride and running for the hills. And they desperately needed my money to do it. The absolute panic in the hospital room, the sheer desperation radiating from Darius, and my mother's unhinged screaming all made perfect sense now. By permanently severing their financial lifeline and locking down my corporate accounts, I had effectively stranded them on the tarmac. I had cut off the massive influx of cash they needed to disappear into the European elite. I had trapped a rat in a sinking ship, and my father was willing to sacrifice his own newborn grandson to buy them a ticket out. Calvin's threat regarding child protective services was a brutal, incredibly dangerous weapon. He knew that the family court system was notoriously biased and deeply flawed. He knew that an allegation of severe postpartum psychosis, backed by a prominent church elder and a wealthy suburban grandmother, would trigger an immediate emergency removal of my son. He planned to use the traumatic head injury from my car crash as the medical justification for my supposed mental breakdown. He was going to initiate a nightmare of bureaucratic red tape that could keep me separated from Malik for months. It was a flawless extortion strategy designed to break my spirit entirely. But my father had made one massive fatal miscalculation. He assumed he was the ultimate authority in my life. He forgot that there was someone else who wielded absolute power over the entire family lineage. I opened a heavily encrypted, highly secure messaging application on my device. I bypassed all of my standard contacts and located a specific number saved under a single initial. The number belonged to Grandpa Elijah. At 78 years old, Elijah was the undisputed iron-fisted patriarch of our extended family. He was a proud, decorated civil rights veteran who had marched for equality and built a highly respected commercial hardware business with his own calloused hands. He was a man of uncompromising moral fortitude, fierce integrity, and brutal honesty. He absolutely despised liars, he loathed thieves, and he commanded a level of respect that bordered on absolute terror. Calvin had spent his entire adult life desperately seeking Elijah's validation, terrified of ever disappointing the rigid patriarch. I knew that a simple phone call would not be enough. Grandpa Elijah operated entirely on hard facts and undeniable evidence. I needed to present a case so airtight that Calvin's lies would crumble before they even reached the judge. I rapidly compiled the raw data from my firm's servers and the devastating intelligence Vance had uncovered into 4 distinct, highly detailed digital files. I attached the first file, naming the document A1_13.docx. This file contained the comprehensive line-by-line ledger of Calvin's fabricated medical expenses. It proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that my father had spent exactly $0 on cardiovascular health care, exposing his entire terminal illness as a grotesque lie. I attached the second file, naming it A2_13.docx. This document held the complete list of scheduled wire transfers explicitly matched to the aggressive down payments on Darius's custom luxury vehicles and Jasmine's excessive designer wardrobe. It was the undeniable financial proof that my hard-earned money had been stolen to finance a fake high society lifestyle. I swiftly uploaded the third file, naming it A3_13.docs. This was the most explosive document of all. It contained the detailed background report from my private investigator, officially exposing Darius's fake investment firm. The file included the heartbreaking list of defrauded church members, the elderly widows, and the working-class families whose life savings had been completely obliterated by my brother-in-law's predatory Ponzi scheme. Finally, I attached the fourth file, naming it A4_13.docx. This document contained the chilling, undeniable proof of Valerie's complicity. It outlined the exact routing numbers, showing my mother transferring my money directly to known loan sharks and illicit violent creditors to cover Darius's collapsing criminal enterprise. I drafted a single concise text message to accompany the heavy payload of evidence. I wrote that Calvin was actively threatening to use Child Protective Services to falsely remove Malik from my custody in order to extort me for escape funds. I stated that Darius was fleeing federal indictments and that my parents were heavily involved in the theft of church congregation funds. I hit send. The secure message locked and transmitted flying through cyberspace directly to the one man who could stop my father in his tracks. The digital delivery confirmation flashed on my screen, verifying that the nuclear option had been officially deployed. I set the iPad down on the rolling tray table and let out a long, slow breath. The intense rush of adrenaline began to recede, leaving my body trembling slightly against the crisp hospital sheets. The burning pain in my fractured collarbone was excruciating, a relentless, sharp agony that wrapped around my neck and radiated down my spine. The heavy bandages binding my chest felt tight and restrictive, but I completely ignored the physical suffering. I smoothed down the edges of my pale hospital gown, meticulously adjusting my posture so that I sat up straight and tall. I refused to look like a victim when they walked back through those double doors. I glanced up at the digital clock mounted on the sterile white wall. 52 minutes had passed since Calvin delivered his vicious ultimatum. I had exactly 8 minutes left before he picked up his phone to orchestrate the kidnapping of my infant son. I turned my head toward the private security nurse I had hired from Sterling Medical Concierge. She was standing quietly near the window, her professional demeanor betraying none of the chaos she had just witnessed. She was a highly trained pediatric specialist with extensive background in private security protocols for elite clients. She knew exactly how to handle hostile threats. I need you to take your position, I said, my voice low and completely devoid of emotion. The nurse nodded silently. She moved across the room with swift, purposeful steps and positioned herself directly in the doorway of the adjoining nursery. She stood with her back straight, her hands clasped loosely in front of her, forming a human barricade between the main recovery suite and the bassinet where Malik was sleeping. I looked her directly in the eyes, ensuring she understood the absolute gravity of my next command. "Nobody enters that room," I instructed coldly. "I do not care if it is a hospital administrator. I do not care if it is a state social worker. And I absolutely do not care if it is the man who just walked out of here claiming to be a concerned grandfather. If anyone attempts to cross that threshold without my explicit verbal authorization, you are to treat them as an immediate threat to my child's life and use whatever force is necessary to stop them." "Understood, ma'am," the nurse replied. Her voice was calm, steady, and immensely reassuring. She widened her stance slightly firmly, planting her feet on the linoleum floor. She was a highly paid professional, and she was entirely ready to do her job. I turned my gaze back toward the heavy wooden double doors leading to the main hospital corridor. The silence in the recovery room was profound, punctuated only by the rhythmic electronic beeping of my heart monitor and the soft hum of the ventilation system. It was the heavy, suffocating calm that always precedes a devastating storm. I had stripped away their financial lifeline. I had uncovered their criminal conspiracy. I had called down the wrath of the family patriarch. The trap they thought they had set for me had actually been built for them. The digital clock on the wall clicked forward. 58 minutes. 59 minutes. Exactly 60 minutes. The heavy brass handle on the double doors slowly began to turn. They were coming back completely oblivious to the fact that their entire world had just been scheduled for demolition. I rested my good hand on top of my hospital blanket and waited for the execution to begin. The doors swung inward with a dramatic, heavy thud. The lineup of my family had shifted, and they had not returned alone. Calvin led the pack, His broad shoulders slumped, his face meticulously arranged into a mask of profound manufactured sorrow. Valerie followed close behind him, clutching a crumpled tissue to her chest, her body shaking with carefully choreographed sobs. Darius and Jasmine flanked them, looking appropriately somber, playing their supporting roles as the devastated siblings to absolute perfection. But it was the fifth figure stepping into my hospital recovery room that made my blood run ice cold. It was Pastor Thomas Williams. He was the head of their massive, affluent megachurch congregation. Pastor Williams was a distinguished man with silver hair, a booming baritone voice, and immense political and social sway in our city. He carried his worn leather Bible tucked securely under his arm, his face etched with genuine pastoral concern. Calvin had not just brought backup, he had brought a star witness. He had brought the one man whose testimony could lend absolute, unimpeachable credibility to his fabricated narrative of my mental collapse. If Pastor Williams told Child Protective Services or a family court judge that I was suffering from severe postpartum psychosis, the state would not hesitate to take Malik. It was a masterstroke of psychological warfare and social manipulation. Valerie did not waste a single second. The moment she crossed the threshold of my recovery room, she launched into a masterful, tearful performance. She fell to her knees right at the foot of my hospital bed, raising her hands toward the sterile fluorescent lights. "Lord, we ask for your healing grace upon this room," Valerie cried out, her voice pitched loud enough to carry through the open doors and directly into the busy hospital corridor. "We bind the spirit of confusion and paranoia that has taken hold of our precious daughter. Please, Jesus, touch her deluded postpartum mind. Return her to her senses so she can properly care for her helpless infant. She is lost in the darkness, Lord." Her wailing was a spectacle of biblical proportions. Several nurses in the hallway stopped in their tracks, peering into the room with wide, alarmed eyes. My private security nurse immediately stepped away from the nursery door, her hand resting squarely on her security radio, ready to call for backup. I caught her eye and gave a sharp, almost imperceptible shake of my head. I needed my nurse to hold her position and let them dig their own graves. Pastor Williams stepped forward, placing a comforting, heavy hand on Valerie's shaking shoulder. He looked at me with deep, pitying eyes, entirely convinced by the elaborate fiction my parents had spun during their hour in the cafeteria. "Nia, my dear child," Pastor Williams began, his voice dropping into that soothing, authoritative cadence he used during Sunday sermons to comfort the grieving. "Your parents came to me in absolute tears. They are terrified for you. You have suffered a terrible trauma, a horrific head injury that is clearly clouding your judgment. You are pushing away the very people who love you most, the people who brought you into this world. The Bible tells us to honor our father and mother, to lean on family in times of trial. You are making wild accusations, shutting them out, and refusing the medication you so desperately need. We are here to pray the darkness away and bring you back to the light." He was actively weaponizing our shared faith, using the sacred tenets of my religion to shame me into submission. It was a holy performance designed to break my will and paint me as a hysterical, brain-damaged woman who was completely unfit to make her own decisions. Calvin, sensing the atmosphere was perfectly primed and the audience was captivated, stepped up beside the pastor. He unlatched the brass locks of his expensive leather briefcase with a sharp click. He reached inside and pulled out a thick stack of pristine, legally binding documents. The crisp, white paper rustled loudly in the quiet room. He held the documents up, presenting them not just to me, but showcasing them for the pastor and the hospital charge nurse who had lingered nervously near the doorway to monitor the commotion. Pastor Williams Calvin said, his voice trembling with a masterful imitation of a heartbroken, desperate father. "As you can see, our daughter is simply overwhelmed. She is a single mother, unmarried and without a husband to protect her. She just survived a massive collision and suffered documented brain damage. She is hallucinating that we are stealing from her. She is pushing away her loving family, and she is behaving erratically. We cannot just stand by and watch her destroy her life and jeopardize our grandson's safety." Calvin stepped closer to the bed, clicking a heavy gold pen and holding it out toward me. He looked deeply into my eyes, his gaze devoid of any parental warmth, completely black and ruthless. I have had our family attorneys draft a comprehensive medical and financial power of attorney. Calvin continued speaking loudly so the entire corridor could hear his supposedly noble intentions. This simply allows us, her loving family, to step in and manage her complex business affairs and medical decisions while she takes the time she desperately needs to heal. It is a durable power of attorney. It is just a temporary measure, a safety net for an overwhelmed, brain-damaged mother who cannot currently care for herself or her newborn. We are just trying to help her survive this tragedy. Jasmine sniffled loudly, wiping away a fake tear with the back of her manicured hand. We just want our sister back, Jasmine added, playing the concerned sibling to absolute perfection. Please, Nia, just sign the papers so we can take care of everything. Darius will even step in to oversee your corporate accounts and offshore investments so your firm does not suffer while you are incapacitated. It was the perfect, inescapable trap. If I yelled, I was hysterical. If I cried, I was emotionally unstable. If I remained silent, I was catatonic and unresponsive. Every single emotional reaction they anticipated would perfectly validate the horrific narrative they had constructed for the pastor and the hospital staff. They desperately wanted me to look crazy. They needed me to look like a broken, delirious woman who required a state-mandated conservatorship. I looked at the gold pen Calvin was holding out to me. I looked at Valerie still kneeling on the floor, weeping loudly into her hands. I looked at Darius, his eyes burning with frantic, greedy anticipation for the money that would save him from federal prison. And then I looked directly at Pastor Williams. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not display a single ounce of the hysteria they were banking on. Instead, I channeled every ounce of executive authority I possessed. I became the ruthless, calculating CEO who had built a multi-million-dollar empire from scratch. I squared my shoulders, ignoring the white-hot pain shooting through my fractured collarbone, and met my father's gaze with absolute chilling calm. No, I stated. The single syllable dropped into the room like a heavy lead weight. It was not a whisper, and it was not a shout. It was crisp, articulate, and completely unyielding. Valerie's dramatic sobbing hitched in her throat, stalling for a fraction of a second before she attempted to ramp it back up. Calvin's outstretched hand wavered, the gold pen suddenly looking ridiculous, hovering over my lap. Nia, please, Pastor Williams urged, stepping closer to the bed, holding his Bible tightly against his chest. You are not thinking clearly, the trauma from the crash. Pastor Williams, I interrupted, my voice slicing through the heavy theatrical air with razor-sharp precision. I am thinking with perfect, absolute clarity. I am not suffering from postpartum psychosis. I do not have brain damage that impairs my cognitive function. I am fully oriented to time, place, and circumstance. I am aware that today is Friday, that I am currently recovering in the trauma wing of City General Hospital, and that I successfully delivered my son Malik, who is sleeping soundly in the next room, under the strict protection of a hired private security detail. The pastor blinked visibly, taken aback by my coherent, incredibly steady response. This was not the raving, hallucinating woman Valerie had just spent an hour describing. This was a highly lucid, sharply articulate business executive issuing a statement of undeniable fact. I shifted my gaze to my mother, who was still kneeling on the linoleum floor, staring up at me with wide, horrified eyes. Her holy performance was rapidly falling apart, entirely undermined by my flat refusal to play the role of the deranged victim. Valerie, you can get up off the floor now, I instructed coldly. The theatrical performance is over. You do not need to pray for my deluded mind because I am fully aware of exactly what is happening in this room. Calvin's face darkened, a dangerous, furious flush creeping up his thick neck. He practically shoved the stack of legal documents into my face. Sign the papers, Nia, he growled. Dropping the concerned father act for a split second, a flash of pure, unadulterated menace bleeding through his tone. Stop being stubborn and do what is best for your family. I did not flinch. I did not back away from the paperwork. I looked directly into his furious, desperate eyes. I will not sign a medical power of attorney because I am perfectly capable of making my own healthcare decisions, I stated, speaking loud enough for the charge nurse lingering in the hallway to hear every single word. And I will absolutely never sign a financial power of attorney handing you or Darius the keys to my corporate accounts or my personal wealth management firm. You are attempting to execute a fraudulent conservatorship by weaponizing my physical injuries and using my newborn son as a hostage. Pastor Williams recoiled, his silver eyebrows shooting up toward his hairline. He looked from me to Calvin, profound confusion etching deep lines across his aged face. "Calvin, what is she talking about?" the pastor asked, his baritone voice wavering with sudden uncertainty. "You said she was completely unresponsive. You said she was entirely detached from reality. She is hallucinating," Calvin lied, frantically trying to shove the genie back into the bottle. "Pastor, do not listen to a word she says. This is the paranoia speaking. She thinks we are trying to steal from her." "I am not hallucinating, Calvin," I fired back, my voice dripping with icy contempt. "I am simply refusing to fund your extravagant lifestyle any longer. I am refusing to be the financial bedrock for a family that views me as nothing more than a profitable asset. And I am explicitly refusing to sign over my company to a brother-in-law who is currently terrified of an impending federal audit." Darius flinched violently, taking a rapid, stumbling step backward, as if I had physically struck him across the face. His tailored suit suddenly looked 2 sizes too big, and a sheen of terrified sweat broke out across his forehead. Jasmine gasped, grabbing her husband's arm in sheer panic. I had hit the bullseye, and the undeniable terror radiating from Darius was impossible for anyone in the room to ignore, especially the pastor. "You brought your pastor here to act as a witness to my supposed mental collapse." I continued, my gaze sweeping across the 4 of them, pinning them down under the harsh hospital lights. "You brought him here to manipulate my faith and shame me into signing away my life's work. You thought that by causing a loud, dramatic scene in the middle of a hospital, you could embarrass me into submission. But your narrative is fundamentally broken. I am not a broken, brain-damaged victim. I am a mother protecting her child from financial predators." The absolute silence that followed my declaration was deafening. The grand, holy performance had completely backfired. By remaining stoic, coherent, and surgically precise, I had shattered Valerie's illusion of a hysterical, out-of-control woman. I had stripped away their mask of righteous concern and exposed the raw, ugly extortion hiding underneath. Pastor Williams took a slow, deliberate step away from Calvin. The seasoned clergyman was not a fool. He had spent decades counseling families and dealing with complex human conflicts. He could clearly see the stark contrast between the hysterical, weeping parents who had dragged him here and the calm, rational woman sitting in the hospital bed. He looked down at his worn Bible, then looked at my father, his expression hardening with dawning realization and deep pastoral disappointment. "Calvin," Pastor Williams said, his voice stripped of its previous warmth, "I believe I have been brought here under entirely false pretenses. Your daughter appears to be of completely sound mind." Calvin opened his mouth to argue, to spin another desperate lie, but before a single word could escape his throat, the heavy wooden doors of my hospital suite swung open once again. The sharp, authoritative click of dress shoes echoed against the linoleum, slicing through the thick, suffocating tension in the room. Marcus, my lead corporate attorney, stepped into the room. His tailored suit was immaculate, his expression carved from granite. He bypassed my stunned family entirely, walking directly to my bedside to hand me my fully charged, heavily encrypted iPad. The 2 hospital security guards, who had been hovering in the corridor, followed right behind him, stepping inside and letting the heavy wooden doors click shut. They crossed their arms, establishing an impenetrable wall of authority. Pastor Williams watched this coordinated tactical maneuver with wide eyes, completely frozen in place. I took the iPad from Marcus and used my good hand to unlock the screen. I opened the massive forensic accounting file Vance had delivered just minutes earlier. I turned the screen brightness all the way up. I pushed the hospital tray table away from my chest and slid the sleek device directly across the smooth surface toward Darius. "Take a very close look at that screen, Darius," I commanded, my voice ringing out with absolute, undeniable authority. "I want you to read the itemized ledger of your impending destruction." Darius stared at the glowing tablet as if it were an active explosive device. He refused to reach for it, his hands trembling violently at his sides. He knew exactly what I had found. Since you are suddenly too terrified to read, I will gladly summarize it for the entire room. I announced loudly, ensuring every single person present heard my words. There are no high-yield technology startups. There is no international venture capital firm. You are running a massive, highly sophisticated affinity fraud operation. It is a textbook Ponzi scheme, Darius. And you built it by preying directly on the elderly widows, the hardworking families, and the trusting parishioners of Pastor Williams' own congregation. Pastor Williams gasped audibly, clutching his Bible tight against his chest. He turned his shocked gaze toward Darius, waiting for a furious denial. But Darius remained completely paralyzed, sweat beading rapidly across his forehead. You used my parents' flawless church reputation to solicit millions of dollars in fraudulent investments. I continued, my voice echoing off the sterile hospital walls. You used the incoming funds from new victims to pay fake dividends to the older investors, skimming hundreds of thousands of dollars off the top to finance your designer suits and luxury cars. But the money ran out, Darius. The scheme is collapsing. You owe violent, unregulated loan sharks a massive sum of money. You are currently under investigation for multiple counts of federal wire fraud. The Securities and Exchange Commission is actively preparing to freeze your fake corporate accounts, and federal indictments are coming down the pipeline. I pointed a steady finger directly at his chest. That luxurious anniversary trip to Monaco is not a vacation. Monaco has highly specific extradition laws regarding white-collar financial crimes. You are trying to flee the jurisdiction of the United States federal government, and you are desperately trying to drag my sister and my mother into international exile with you. You needed my money to fund your escape, and because I froze my accounts, you are currently stranded. You are going to federal prison, Darius. The recovery room erupted into absolute bedlam. Jasmine let out an ear-piercing, hysterical shriek. She threw her arms around Darius, clinging to his bespoke suit jacket, as if I had just ordered his execution. "You are lying!" Jasmine screamed at the top of her lungs, her perfectly manicured nails digging into his shoulders. Tell her she is lying, Darius. Tell them all this is just another one of her sick, paranoid delusions. You are a successful entrepreneur. We are wealthy. We are going to Monaco. Make her stop saying these horrible things. Darius could not form a single coherent word. He was hyperventilating, his eyes darting frantically around the room, searching for an exit that did not exist. Valerie stepped forward, her face contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. She aggressively pointed her finger at my face, entirely abandoning her previous performance of the weeping, prayerful mother. "How dare you fabricate these malicious, disgusting lies about your sister's husband?" Valerie shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly in the confined space. "You are sick, Nia. You are a bitter, jealous, unmarried woman. You have spent your entire life resenting Jasmine because she found a good man who provides for her. You are so miserable and alone that you are actively inventing federal crimes just to destroy her perfect marriage. You cannot stand the fact that she has a husband to protect her while you are sitting in a hospital bed with a fatherless child." Calvin immediately backed up his wife, his booming voice joining the chaotic chorus of denial. "This is exactly the severe mental breakdown we were warning you about," Pastor Calvin yelled, gesturing wildly toward me. "Listen to these insane, fabricated accusations. She has lost her mind entirely. She is having a paranoid, psychotic break right in front of us. Darius is a brilliant businessman and a pillar of our community. He would never steal from the church." They were doubling down, frantically trying to gaslight me, the pastor and the security staff, into believing my evidence was nothing more than a symptom of a severe traumatic brain injury. They were desperately clinging to their flawless social narrative, utterly refusing to accept that their criminal enterprise had been exposed in broad daylight. But Calvin quickly realized that the intimidation was completely failing. He saw the cold, analytical glint in my eyes. He saw Marcus standing by my bed, an immovable legal fortress. He saw the hospital security guards gripping their utility belts, wholly unimpressed by his loud, aggressive blustering. He knew the money was locked down tight and his grand escape plan was rapidly disintegrating. The intimidation had failed. The holy performance had failed. It was time for him to execute his ultimate devastating threat. Calvin's face morphed into a mask of absolute ruthless determination. He reached into his tailored slacks and pulled out his smartphone. He glared at me with terrifying, predatory intent. "You leave me absolutely no choice, Nia," Calvin stated, his voice dropping into a deadly, gravelly register. "You are a profound danger to yourself and a direct physical threat to my grandson. If you will not voluntarily hand over control of your estate to your family, I will let the state take your child." He aggressively tapped the screen of his phone, dialing the emergency hotline for Child Protective Services. He pressed the speakerphone button and held the device up high in the air, ensuring every single person in the room could hear the harsh automated ringing tone echoing through the suite. My heart slammed violently against my fractured ribs, but I forced my facial expression to remain entirely blank. I could not show a single ounce of fear. I had already dispatched the encrypted files to Grandpa Elijah, and I had to trust that the formidable patriarch would bring down the hammer before the state authorities dispatched an emergency social worker to my hospital room. The automated ringing continued, a sharp, piercing sound that cut right through Jasmine's hysterical sobbing and Valerie's frantic defensive rambling. But the ringing tone was suddenly drowned out by a completely different sound. Darius finally snapped. The immense crushing pressure of the impending FBI warrants the exposure of his affinity fraud, and the terrifying realization that I held the digital key to his total destruction pushed him right over the absolute edge of reason. He looked at the iPad resting on my tray table. He saw the glowing screen displaying the undeniable proof of his stolen millions. In his desperate, panic-stricken mind, destroying that specific piece of hardware would somehow erase the digital evidence stored safely on my firm's cloud servers. Darius let out a guttural, panicked roar. He shoved Jasmine away with such violent force that she stumbled backward, her designer heels slipping on the linoleum floor. He lowered his head and lunged directly toward my hospital bed, his arms outstretched fully, intending to physically snatch the iPad and smash it into 1,000 pieces against the wall. He moved with surprising speed. A desperate man backed into a lethal corner. He closed the distance between us in a fraction of a second, his hands reaching aggressively over my injured legs toward the tray table. But he never even came close to touching it. My private pediatric nurse, who had been standing like a silent sentinel by the nursery door, sprang into action with terrifying, highly trained precision. She moved faster than Darius, stepping squarely into his path and throwing up a rigid defensive block. She shoved her forearm forcefully into the center of his chest, halting his forward momentum with a sharp, breathless thud. At the exact same moment, the two hospital security guards surged forward from the entrance. They flanked Darius from behind, their heavy hands clamping down viciously on his custom-tailored shoulders. They jerked him backward with brute, uncompromising force, dragging him forcefully away from my hospital bed. "Get your hands off me," Darius screamed, thrashing wildly against the security officers holding him. "I need that tablet. She is lying. Give it to me." "Stand down immediately, sir," the lead security guard bellowed, using his considerable body weight to pin Darius firmly against the pale hospital wall. "If you make one more aggressive move toward this patient, you will be leaving this hospital in handcuffs. Do you understand me?" Darius continued to struggle, his chest heaving violently, his perfectly styled hair now a disheveled, sweaty mess. Jasmine covered her mouth with both hands, letting out a series of high-pitched, terrified squeaks as she watched her husband being physically subdued by armed security. Valerie rushed forward, attempting to intervene, but Marcus swiftly stepped into her path, holding up a warning hand that radiated pure legal menace. "Take one more step toward my client, Valerie," Marcus warned, his voice dangerously low and smooth, "and I will personally press federal assault and battery charges against every single member of this family. Back away from the bed right now." Calvin remained frozen in the center of the room, his phone still held high in the air, the speakerphone projecting the automated voice of the CPS intake menu. He stared in absolute horrified shock as his perfect, highly respected son-in-law was wrestled against the wall like a common street criminal. The pristine, affluent image they had spent decades cultivating was being violently shredded right in front of Pastor Williams. I sat perfectly still amidst the absolute chaos, my uninjured hand resting lightly on top of the iPad. The physical altercation, the screaming, the sheer unprecedented violence of Darius's lunging attack only served to permanently cement my position. They had brought the pastor here to witness my supposed mental breakdown. Instead, Pastor Williams was standing frozen near the door, his eyes wide with profound disbelief, watching the supposed golden child of his congregation attempt to physically assault an injured woman in a hospital bed. The automated voice on Calvin's phone finally clicked over to a live operator. Child Protective Services Emergency Hotline, a stern, professional female voice announced through the speaker. Please state the nature of your emergency. Calvin hesitated. He looked at Darius pinned against the wall. He looked at Valerie shaking with rage. He looked at Pastor Williams, whose face had hardened into an expression of absolute disgust. And then Calvin looked at me. He expected to see a terrified, broken daughter begging him to hang up the phone. He expected to see me surrender my empire to save my son. Instead, he saw a woman forged in fire, completely unafraid of the flames. I stared directly into my father's eyes, issuing a silent, lethal challenge. I dared him to speak. I dared him to tell the state authorities that I was the unstable one in the room. I dared him to cross the ultimate line. The operator's voice crackled through the speaker again, sharper this time. Hello, is anyone there? Please state the nature of your child welfare emergency. The entire room fell into a suffocating, breathless silence. The only sounds were the heavy, ragged breathing of Darius struggling against the security guards and the steady, rhythmic beeping of my heart monitor, keeping perfect time as I waited for my father to seal his own fate. Yes, operator. I have a severe medical emergency, Calvin finally said, crossing the ultimate line of betrayal. His voice instantly transformed, losing the aggressive, gravelly edge and adopting the trembling, heartbroken tone of a terrified parent. I am at City General Hospital in the Trauma Recovery Wing Room 412. My daughter was in a horrific car accident 2 days ago. She suffered a severe brain injury, and she is currently experiencing a violent delusional psychotic break. I sat perfectly still, my face a mask of carved stone, watching my own father systematically attempt to destroy my life. She just had a baby. Calvin continued pacing back and forth near the foot of my bed, completely ignoring Marcus, who had pulled out his own phone and began recording the entire interaction for our counter lawsuit. She is wildly paranoid. She is hallucinating that her family is trying to steal from her. She is aggressive, irrational, and completely detached from reality. She is refusing her psychiatric medication, and we are absolutely terrified that she is going to harm her newborn son. We need an emergency duty worker here immediately to take custody of the infant before she does something irreversible. The hospital room had become an absolute powder keg, a chaotic symphony of desperate, flailing criminals. While Calvin fed his disgusting, fabricated lies to the state authorities, Darius continued his pathetic, violent struggle against the two massive security guards. His expensive suit jacket ripped at the shoulder seam as he thrashed, his face red and slick with panicked sweat. He spat furious. Incoherent threats at my private nurse, who remained planted like a brick wall in front of the nursery door, completely unbothered by his flailing. Darius knew his entire life was over if those digital files saw the light of day, and he was fighting with the mindless, rabid energy of a trapped animal. Jasmine was backed into the corner, openly weeping now, her hands tangled in her hair as she watched her husband unravel into a violent mess. She kept whimpering his name, but Darius was too consumed by his own terror to even acknowledge her presence. Valerie, realizing that Pastor Williams was standing by the door, looking profoundly disturbed by the escalating violence, decided to double down on her holy performance. She threw her hands toward the ceiling, weeping loudly, and began pacing the room alongside Calvin. Lord, cast out the demons of paranoia! Valerie wailed, her voice shrill and grating over the sounds of Darius's struggle. The devil has taken our daughter's mind. Pastor, please pray for her soul. Pray that the state arrives quickly to save our poor, helpless grandson from this madness. Pastor Williams did not pray. The distinguished clergyman looked entirely appalled. He stared at Darius, the supposed pillar of his church community, acting like a deranged thug. He looked at Calvin coldly, reporting his injured daughter to the state. And then he looked at me sitting calmly in my hospital bed, completely silent, flanked by a silent attorney and a highly trained security detail. The pastor took another slow step backward, gripping the doorframe visibly, realizing he had been dragged into a viper's nest of deceit. The room was a swirling vortex of noise, violence, and malicious lies. Calvin was giving the CPS operator my full legal name and date of birth. Darius was grunting and kicking against the wall. Valerie was shouting scripture into the sterile hospital air. They were so entirely consumed by their own chaotic desperation that they did not hear the sound at first. But I heard it. It started out in the main hospital corridor, cutting through the ambient noise of the busy trauma wing. Clack! It was a sharp, heavy, unmistakable sound, the harsh strike of brass against polished linoleum. Clack! It was methodical. It was unhurried. It was terrifyingly precise. Clack! The sound grew louder, echoing down the hallway toward room 412. I felt a sudden electric thrill shoot straight down my spine, entirely eclipsing the burning pain in my fractured collarbone. I recognized that sound instantly. Every single person who shared my bloodline recognized that sound. It was deeply, permanently ingrained into our collective psychology from childhood. Valerie stopped her theatrical praying mid-sentence. Her hands froze in the air, her eyes widening in sudden absolute terror as the sound registered in her brain. She slowly lowered her arms, the fake tears drying up instantly, as all the blood drained rapidly from her face. Calvin paused his frantic conversation with the CPS operator. He pulled the phone slightly away from his ear, his head snapping toward the open doorway. The confident, heartbroken father act vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated panic. Even Darius, thrashing wildly against the security guards, suddenly ceased his struggling. He went completely limp against the wall, his chest heaving, his panicked eyes darting toward the corridor. The heavy brass-tipped oak cane struck the threshold of my hospital suite. The loud, resounding clack echoed like a gunshot in the suddenly silent room, silencing the chaos entirely. Grandpa Elijah walked into the room. The 78-year-old patriarch of our family did not simply enter a space, he commanded it. Despite his advanced age, he stood well over 6 feet tall, his spine as straight as a steel rod. He was impeccably dressed in a custom-tailored charcoal gray 3-piece suit, a crisp white shirt, and a deep burgundy tie. His silver hair was perfectly groomed, his jaw set in a line of unyielding, furious granite. He carried his heavy oak cane in his right hand not for balance but as a symbol of absolute, unquestionable authority. Elijah was a king stepping into a room full of disgraced, pathetic peasants. He carried an aura of power so intense, so overwhelmingly dominant, that the temperature in the hospital suite seemed to plummet by 10 degrees. His dark obsidian eyes swept across the room, taking in every single detail with razor-sharp precision. He saw the torn suit on Darius. He saw the security guards. He saw the panicked, guilty expressions plastered across my parents' faces. He missed absolutely nothing. But Grandpa Elijah had not come alone. He did not bring my aunts, my uncles, or any other family members to witness this disgrace. As he stepped fully into the room, 2 men filed in closely behind him. They were tall, broad-shouldered, and dressed in nondescript dark navy suits. They wore subtle earpieces and carried themselves with a quiet, lethal professionalism that immediately identified them as federal law enforcement. They stepped out from behind the patriarch, moving with synchronized precision. Reaching into their jacket pockets, they simultaneously withdrew flat leather wallets and flipped them open, exposing bright, gleaming gold badges. Special Agent Miller and Special Agent Hayes, the taller of the 2 men, announced, his voice devoid of any emotion. Federal Bureau of Investigation, Financial Crimes Division. The silence that slammed down over the hospital room was absolute, suffocating, and profound. The air grew so thick and heavy, it was practically unbreathable. The sheer magnitude of what was happening crashed down upon my family with the destructive force of an avalanche. Calvin's mouth fell open in a silent, horrified gasp. The smartphone slipped entirely from his trembling fingers. It hit the linoleum floor with a sharp crack, the screen shattering on impact. From the tiny broken speaker on the floor, the tiny voice of the CPS operator continued to call out, asking if he was still there, asking for more information. Marcus casually stepped forward and drove the heel of his expensive Italian leather shoe directly down onto the phone screen, crushing the device and silencing the operator's voice forever. Calvin did not even flinch. He was completely paralyzed, staring at his father in pure, abject terror. Valerie looked as though she might physically collapse. The high society socialite, the woman who had just spent an hour screaming about my mental instability, was now trembling so violently she had to reach out and grip the edge of a rolling medical cart just to remain standing. She stared at the FBI badges, her eyes darting frantically toward the door, as if calculating an escape route that simply did not exist. Jasmine let out a pathetic, strangled whimper and pressed her hands over her mouth, backing away from her husband and flattening herself against the far wall. But Darius was the most spectacular sight of all. The charismatic venture capitalist, the golden son-in-law, the man who had confidently threatened to lock me in a psychiatric ward just moments earlier, completely shattered. All the color drained from his face, leaving behind a sickly grayish-white pallor. His knees actually buckled, and if the two hospital security guards had not been firmly gripping his arms, he would have collapsed entirely into a heap on the floor. He stared at the federal agents with wide, unblinking eyes, his mouth opening and closing without producing a single sound. He knew the Monaco trip was dead. He knew his luxury cars, his designer suits, and his entire fraudulent life were gone. The federal indictments were no longer impending. They were standing right inside the room. Pastor Williams, who had been completely sidelined by the escalating madness, stared at Grandpa Elijah with profound respect. He recognized the patriarch immediately. Elijah had helped fund the construction of their megachurch 3 decades ago. The pastor quickly stepped back, pressing his Bible to his chest, making absolutely sure he was not standing anywhere near my parents or Darius. Grandpa Elijah did not look at Calvin. He did not look at Valerie. He did not even look at the pathetic trembling mess of Darius pinned against the wall. He walked slowly, deliberately across the room, the brass tip of his cane clicking against the floor with every step until he stood directly beside my hospital bed. He looked down at me, his sharp eyes taking in the heavy bandages strapped across my chest, the dark, angry bruising mottling my face, and the sling holding my fractured collarbone in place. His expression softened, just for a fraction of a second, a silent, powerful acknowledgement of everything I had endured to protect my son and my legacy. I looked back at him, sitting up perfectly straight, refusing to break eye contact with the only person in this family who possessed a moral compass. Then Elijah slowly turned around. He leaned his weight heavily onto his brass-tipped cane, squaring his broad shoulders as he finally faced the miserable, terrified group of criminals cowering in the center of the room. His dark eyes locked directly onto Calvin, pinning his son in place with a gaze that radiated absolute scorching fury. "You have disgraced my name," Elijah said. His voice was a low, dangerous rumble that vibrated through the very floorboards of the hospital suite. It was not a shout. It did not need to be. The quiet, lethal authority in his tone was infinitely more terrifying than any screaming match. "You come into a hospital room?" Elijah continued, his voice dripping with profound, sickening disgust, "and you attempt to extort a woman who has just survived a near-fatal collision. You attempt to weaponize the state against your own flesh and blood. You threaten to throw my great-grandson into the foster care system over a frozen credit card. You steal from the very community I marched to protect. You facilitate federal fraud, and you drag the church into your filthy, pathetic schemes." Calvin opened his mouth, his hands shaking violently as he took a tentative step forward. "Dad, please. You have to understand," Calvin pleaded, his voice cracking, shedding tears that were finally completely genuine. "It is a misunderstanding. We were just trying to help her. She is not well." "Do not you dare lie to me, Calvin," Elijah commanded, slamming the heavy tip of his oak cane down against the linoleum with a deafening crack that made everyone in the room flinch. "Do not insult my intelligence. I have read the files. I have seen the wire transfers. I have seen the offshore accounts and the payouts to violent loan sharks. I know exactly what you are. You are a thief. You are a coward. And as of this exact moment, you are no longer a son of mine. Calvin let out a choked, devastated sob, burying his face in his hands. The absolute final rejection from the patriarch was the killing blow, severing him entirely from the legacy and the wealth he had spent his entire life trying to manipulate. Elijah turned his burning gaze toward Darius and the two federal agents standing quietly near the doorway. He gestured toward his son-in-law with a flick of his hand, issuing the final inescapable verdict. "Agents," Elijah said coldly, "take this trash out of my sight." The two federal agents stepped forward in perfect synchronized unison, their hands reaching for the heavy steel handcuffs resting on their tactical belts. But before they could lay a single finger on Darius, Elijah raised his brass-tipped cane just an inch off the floor. It was a silent, commanding gesture that instantly froze the FBI agents in their tracks. The patriarch was not quite finished. Elijah slowly turned his broad back on the cowering, pathetic men and walked toward the head of my hospital bed. The scorching, lethal fury that had just radiated from him vanished entirely, replaced by a profound, gentle warmth that he reserved exclusively for those who had earned his deepest respect. He reached out with a weathered, calloused hand and gently touched my uninjured shoulder. "You did well, Nia," Elijah said, his deep voice thick with absolute pride. "You stood your ground against a pack of starving wolves, and you protected your cub. You have the heart of a true lioness. Are you in severe pain, child? I will survive, Grandpa," I replied, my voice remarkably steady, though the sheer, overwhelming relief of his protective presence threatened to break my stoic composure. Elijah nodded approvingly, his sharp obsidian eyes crinkling at the corners. He turned his gaze toward the adjoining nursery, where my private security nurse still stood guard like an impenetrable stone statue. "And my great-grandson. Is the boy healthy?" "He is perfect," I said, a genuine hard-won smile finally touching my lips. "His name is Malik." Malik, Elijah repeated, testing the heavy syllables on his tongue. "A king's name, fitting for a boy who will inherit a true, honest legacy. He is safe now, Nia. Nobody is going to lay a single hand on that child while I am still drawing breath." The tender, quiet moment was violently interrupted by a pathetic, desperate whine from the center of the room. Calvin simply could not accept the reality of his total catastrophic defeat. His massive ego, inflated by decades of unchecked narcissism and manufactured authority, forcefully rejected the concept that his elaborate extortion plot was collapsing around him. He scrambled up from his knees, his face red and slick with panicked sweat, pointing a trembling finger at my bed. "Dad, you are not seeing this clearly," Calvin begged, his voice cracking with desperate, frantic urgency. "You cannot possibly believe her over us. She is unwell. You are looking at a woman suffering from severe documented postpartum trauma. She is mentally unstable. She has fabricated this entire federal conspiracy because she is having a psychotic break. We only brought the pastor here to stage an intervention. We only called CPS to protect the baby. She is out of her mind, Dad. You have to listen to me." Elijah slowly turned his head to look at his son. The gentle warmth vanished from his features, instantly replaced by a cold, calculating void that was infinitely more terrifying than his previous shouting. He gripped the brass handle of his oak cane and took one deliberate, heavy step toward Calvin. "I have never been senile." "Calvin," Elijah stated, his voice a low, brutal whisper that cut through the sterile hospital air like a freshly sharpened blade. "I hired forensic accountants 5 years ago. I know Nia built her empire with her own blood and sweat, and I know you and your wife are nothing but parasites bleeding her dry." Calvin's mouth fell open, his eyes widening in sheer, unadulterated horror as the floor fell out from underneath his entire universe. "Did you truly believe that I would sit back and blindly hand over the keys to our family legacy without knowing exactly who was standing in the room with me?" Elijah continued, stepping closer, forcing Calvin to cower backward against the rolling medical cart. I have been watching your bank accounts, your offshore wire transfers, and your highly questionable medical records for half a decade. I watched Nia work 80-hour weeks. I watched her secure international contracts. I watched her build a fortress of genuine self-made wealth while you sat in luxury country clubs bragging about financial accomplishments that did not belong to you. Valerie let out a strangled, horrified gasp, covering her face with her shaking hands as Elijah turned his piercing gaze toward her. "And you!" Elijah growled, his voice rising in volume, vibrating with absolute unfiltered disgust. "You faked a terminal cardiovascular illness to extort money from your own injured daughter. You watched her drain her corporate accounts to pay for non-existent surgeries while you used that cash to finance your pathetic, desperate illusion of high society grandeur. You are a disgrace to the very concept of motherhood, Valerie. You are a hollow, greedy shell of a woman, and you have poisoned your other daughter with the exact same venom." Elijah turned his attention back to Calvin, who was now visibly shaking, tears of absolute terror and profound shame streaming down his cheeks. "When Nia sent me those encrypted files this morning, they merely confirmed what my private investigators already suspected," Elijah stated coldly. "The only thing that truly surprised me was your absolute willingness to weaponize the state against your own flesh and blood. To threaten to throw my great-grandson into the foster care system just to cover your tracks and fund a European escape. You are dead to me, Calvin. Do not ever speak my name again." Elijah turned his broad back on his son, dismissing him completely and entirely. He looked at the two federal agents standing quietly near the doorway and gave a single sharp nod. "Proceed," Elijah commanded. Special Agent Miller and Special Agent Hayes stepped forward, their movements swift and highly practiced. They bypassed Calvin and Valerie, entirely walking straight toward Darius, who was still pinned against the wall by the hospital security guards. The venture capitalist looked absolutely pathetic. His custom-tailored suit jacket was torn at the shoulder, his silk tie hung loosely around his neck, and his face was completely devoid of color. He looked like a man standing on the gallows staring down the barrel of an executioner's rifle. Darius Vance, Agent Miller, said, his voice ringing out with undeniable federal authority. "You are under arrest." Darius let out a pathetic, high-pitched whimper as the hospital security guard stepped back, allowing the federal agents to take absolute control. Agent Hayes grabbed Darius by the shoulder, spinning him around and forcefully pressing his chest against the sterile white wall. The sound of cold steel ratcheting tight echoed sharply through the quiet room as the agent snapped the heavy handcuffs securely around Darius's wrists. "You have the right to remain silent," Agent Miller recited, pulling a printed warrant from his inside jacket pocket and holding it up for Darius to see. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You have the right to an attorney. If you cannot afford an attorney, one will be provided for you. You are being officially charged with multiple counts of federal wire fraud, conspiracy to commit fraud, grand larceny, and attempting to flee federal prosecution." "No, please." Darius sobbed, his voice cracking as the agents jerked him away from the wall. "Please, I can fix this. I can pay the money back. Just give me time. Do not do this. Do not take me to jail. Please, I am a businessman." The sight of her husband in steel handcuffs finally broke the dam of Jasmine's fragile manufactured reality. The illusion of her endless wealth, her overflowing designer wardrobes, her exclusive country club memberships, and her perfect suburban life shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The impending Monaco escape was completely dead. The luxury sports cars were gone. Her husband was a federal criminal, and she was entirely complicit in his grand collapsing scheme. Jasmine threw her head back and unleashed a blood-curdling, hysterical scream that tore through the hospital suite. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated psychological destruction. "No," Jasmine shrieked, launching herself forward and grabbing desperately onto Agent Hayes' arm. "You cannot take him. He is a venture capitalist. We are wealthy. You are making a terrible mistake. Nia is the one who is crazy. Take her. Arrest her. She made all of this up." "Ma'am, step back immediately," Agent Hayes commanded easily, shrugging off her frantic grip and putting a solid, unyielding forearm between Jasmine and her handcuffed husband. "Interfering with a federal arrest is a felony offense. Back away right now." Jasmine did not listen. Her mind had completely fractured under the crushing weight of her impending social and financial ruin. She fell to her knees on the hard linoleum floor, tearing at her own hair, her expensive designer dress bunching up around her thighs. She wailed, slamming her manicured hands against the floorboards, completely losing whatever shred of dignity she had left to her name. "My life is over." Jasmine sobbed hysterically, her expensive mascara running down her cheeks in thick, dark streaks. "My friends will know. The church congregation will know. I will have absolutely nothing. You ruined my life, Nia. You ruined everything." I looked down at my sister, watching her writhe on the floor in a puddle of her own ruined ego. I felt absolutely no pity for her. Pity. I felt no remorse for the actions I had taken. I felt only the cold, satisfying sting of absolute justice. "You ruined your own life, Jasmine," I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly over her pathetic sobbing. "You chose a thief for a husband, and you happily spent the millions of dollars he stole from innocent people. Enjoy the consequences of your own greed." Pastor Williams, who had been watching this entire scene unfold in horrified, breathless silence, finally decided he had seen enough. The distinguished clergyman looked at Calvin and Valerie, his face etched with profound disgust and righteous anger. "May God have mercy on your souls," Pastor Williams said, his booming baritone voice shaking with revulsion. "Because this congregation certainly will not. Do not ever set foot inside my church again." Pastor Williams turned on his heel, adjusting the grip on his worn leather Bible. He did not say another word, but the profound disappointment etched deeply into his features spoke volumes. He walked out of the hospital suite, the heavy wooden doors swinging shut behind him, permanently sealing my family inside their own personal purgatory. Agent Miller and Agent Hayes did not waste a single second. They hauled Darius up from the floor, his expensive Italian leather shoes scraping pathetically against the polished linoleum. Darius wept openly now, completely abandoning his suave, aristocratic persona. He begged for a phone call, he begged to negotiate a deal, but the federal agents remained entirely stoic and unmoved. They dragged the disgraced venture capitalist out of the room, his rights being read to him, echoing down the hospital corridor, leaving a devastating trail of shattered illusions in his wake. Jasmine remained crumpled in the corner, her shrieks reducing to harsh, rhythmic gasps for air. Her perfectly curated life was over. Her social standing was utterly obliterated, and she lacked the emotional capacity to process the sheer magnitude of her sudden downfall. She curled into a tight ball on the floor, rocking back and forth, completely ignoring the rest of the room. With Darius gone and Jasmine incapacitated by her own vanity, the suffocating silence returned to the suite. Calvin and Valerie were now the sole focus of Grandpa Elijah's blistering, inescapable wrath. The survival instinct of a cornered narcissist is a truly remarkable phenomenon to witness. Without missing a single beat, my parents pivoted. They instantly shed their previous fierce alliance with Darius and attempted to scramble onto whatever moral high ground they could fabricate out of thin air. Calvin straightened his ruined posture, smoothing the lapels of his suit jacket with trembling hands. He looked at Elijah, his face twisting into an expression of profound manufactured shock. "Dad, you have to believe us," Calvin pleaded, his voice dripping with desperate, frantic sincerity. "We had absolutely no idea. Darius completely fooled us. He manipulated our trust. He used our position in the church to get to those innocent people. We are victims in this too. He lied to us about the investments, and he lied to us about the money. We would never intentionally associate with a federal criminal. We were totally blindsided by his actions." Valerie immediately caught on to her husband's transparent strategy. She nodded vigorously, stepping away from the rolling medical cart and moving closer to Calvin to present a united, victimized front. "It is the absolute truth," Elijah Valerie cried out, placing a hand dramatically over her heart. "Darius is a monster. He took advantage of our good nature. We thought he was a successful businessman. We were completely blinded by his charm and his promises. You cannot possibly blame us for his horrific actions. We are just as devastated by this betrayal as Nia is. We are grieving this deception right alongside her." Grandpa Elijah did not move an inch. He simply stood there, leaning heavily on his brass-tipped cane, staring at them with obsidian eyes utterly devoid of mercy. He let their pathetic, transparent lies hang in the sterile hospital air, allowing the sheer absurdity of their claims to echo around the room before he finally spoke. Victims. Elijah repeated the words sounding like pure poison on his tongue. You stand there and claim to be victims. Do you honestly believe I am a fool, Calvin? Do you think I did not see the bank statements showing Valerie transferring Nia's hard-earned money directly to Darius's violent creditors? Do you think I did not see the purchase orders for the luxury vehicles and the designer wardrobes that Darius magically funded right after you introduced him to your wealthiest church members? You knew exactly what he was doing. You turned a blind eye to the fraud because you were actively profiting from it. You are complicit, Calvin. You are both entirely complicit. Calvin swallowed hard, the last remaining drops of color draining from his face. Dad, please. Calvin stammered, his voice dropping to a panicked whisper. You are angry. I understand that. But you cannot do this. You cannot cast us out. We have a reputation to maintain. We have a pristine standing in the community. What will people say? What will happen to us? That is the absolute crux of your existence, is it not? Elijah asked, taking a slow, heavy step forward, closing the distance between them. Your reputation. Your pathetic, hollow social standing. You have spent your entire adult life pretending to be a self-made titan of industry, Calvin. You strut around that suburban megachurch acting like a wealthy patriarch. You host those lavish high society parties looking down your nose at the working class and acting as though you earned your place at the table. But your entire life is a mirage. It is a carefully constructed house of cards, and you do not even own the land it is built on. Valerie gasped, taking a sudden step backward, her eyes darting nervously between her husband and her father-in-law. What are you talking about? Valerie demanded, her voice shaking with sudden, terrible apprehension. I am talking about the reality of your situation, Valerie, Elijah stated coldly, shifting his terrifying gaze to her. I am talking about the sprawling, luxurious suburban mansion you currently reside in, the one with the vaulted ceilings, the marble floors, and the manicured lawns where you host your exclusive garden parties, the house you love to show off to your wealthy friends. Calvin's knees visibly buckled, a strangled sound escaping his throat. He knew exactly what was coming, and he was powerless to stop it. The illusion he had maintained for decades was about to be burned to ash. I have never been senile, Calvin. Elijah continued, his voice echoing with brutal, commanding finality. I hired forensic accountants 5 years ago. I know Nia built her empire with her own blood and sweat, and I know you and your wife are nothing but parasites bleeding her dry. You have been living rent-free on my dime for 25 years. You never actually purchased that property, Calvin. You could never afford it. I bought that estate. I paid the property taxes. I funded the maintenance. The deed to that house is legally registered in my name under my holding company. I allowed you to live there because I wanted my granddaughters to have a stable home. I tolerated your ridiculous posturing because I hoped you would eventually grow into a man worthy of the life I provided for you. But you are not a man, Calvin. You are a parasite. Valerie let out a sharp, breathless shriek, her hands flying to her mouth as the devastating truth crashed over her. You threatened to take my great-grandson, Calvin! Elijah roared, his voice dropping into a register so dark and dangerous it made the hairs on my arms stand up. I am officially disinheriting you. I am transferring the deed of your house into an irrevocable trust for Malik. You and Valerie have 30 days to pack your bags and get out of my property. The words struck Calvin with the force of a physical blow. He staggered backward, hitting the wall beside the closed double doors. His entire identity, his wealth, his home, his social standing was instantly vaporized. He was 58 years old, and he was being evicted by his own father. He was going to be completely penniless, publicly disgraced, and forced out onto the street with absolutely nothing to his name. You cannot do this, Calvin whimpered, sliding down the wall until he was crouching on the linoleum floor, a broken, defeated shell of a man. We have nowhere to go. We have no savings. Darius lost it all. We will be ruined. we will have nothing, Valerie finally snapped. The sheer, overwhelming terror of losing her mansion, her status, and her entire affluent lifestyle completely shattered her immense pride. She realized that Grandpa Elijah was an immovable mountain of wrath. There was absolutely no reasoning with him, and there was no manipulating him. His mind was permanently made up. She had only one option left. Valerie scrambled across the hospital floor on her hands and knees. She ignored the expensive fabric of her designer dress tearing against the linoleum. She crawled directly toward my hospital bed, her face streaked with ruined makeup, her eyes wide with frantic animalistic desperation. She reached up and grabbed the metal bed rails with white-knuckled force, hauling herself up until her face was inches from mine. Nia, Valerie begged, her voice a ragged, hysterical screech that grated against my ears. Nia, please, you have to stop him. You have to tell him to let us keep the house. We are your parents. We are your family. We raised you. We gave you everything. You cannot let him throw us out on the street like garbage. She shook the metal bed rails violently, her manicured nails digging into the steel. I stared at her, feeling absolutely nothing. The well of my empathy was completely dry. Please, Nia. Valerie wailed, tears pouring down her cheeks, dripping onto the crisp white hospital blankets covering my legs. I am your mother. You have to show mercy. We are blood. We made a mistake, but we are still your blood. You cannot let your own parents be homeless. Look at me. Look at what you are doing to us. You have your money, you have your company, you have your beautiful baby boy. You have everything you could possibly want in this world. Just let us have the house. Talk to Elijah. Tell him you forgive us. Tell him we are a family. We are not a family, Valerie. I interrupted, my voice dropping into a register of absolute terrifying calm. I reached out with my uninjured hand and forcefully pried her manicured fingers off the steel bed rails, pushing her hands away with distinct physical revulsion. You do not get to use that word anymore. I looked down at the woman who had given birth to me, feeling nothing but a profound hollow emptiness, where a daughter's love used to reside. You stood in this room and actively conspired to take my newborn son away from me. You tried to use my physical trauma to execute a fraudulent conservatorship so you could steal my company and flee the country when my son needed you. You chose a scammer's trip to Monaco. Blood doesn't give you the right to destroy me. We are done. Valerie let out a desperate, choking sob, trying to reach for my hand again, but I pulled it away, retreating against the hospital pillows. Blood does not give you a free pass to exploit my hard work, gaslight my reality, and throw me to the wolves the second my money stops flowing into your bank accounts. I stated, each word striking the air like a hammer hitting an anvil. You are a toxic, parasitic presence in my life, and I am severing the connection entirely. We are officially, permanently done. I looked past her weeping form and locked eyes with the hospital security guards who were already moving in to assist the federal agents. Get them out of my room, I commanded. The extraction was swift, humiliating, and incredibly satisfying to watch. Special Agent Miller and Special Agent Hayes hauled Darius Vance upright, completely ignoring his pathetic, tearful begging. The sophisticated venture capitalist who had strutted into my hospital room wearing a bespoke suit and a smug smile was now a blubbering, broken mess. They dragged him through the double doors, reading him the remainder of his Miranda rights as they marched him down the trauma wing corridor toward a waiting federal holding cell. His fake empire had officially collapsed into dust. Jasmine was next. Stripped of her arrogant high society facade, my sister had regressed into a terrified, hysterical child. 2 hospital security guards had to physically lift her from the linoleum floor. She kicked and thrashed, screaming my name, screaming for Darius, screaming that her life was ruined. Her shrieks echoed down the hallway, fading slowly as they escorted her out of the building, completely destroying whatever microscopic shred of dignity she had left. Calvin and Valerie were the last to be removed. 2 local police officers who had arrived as backup for the federal agents stepped forward and clamped their hands firmly onto Calvin's sagging shoulders. The former patriarch of our suburban church community did not fight back. He did not say a single word. He walked out of the room with his head hung low, utterly defeated, looking 20 years older than he had when he walked in. Valerie followed behind him, weeping loudly into her hands, wailing about losing her mansion and her social standing. Nobody in the hallway offered her a single ounce of sympathy. And just like that, the toxic infection that had plagued my entire life was surgically removed. The heavy wooden doors swung shut, cutting off the sounds of their humiliating departure. The sudden, overwhelming silence that washed over the hospital suite was absolutely beautiful. It was the deep, resonant quiet of a battlefield after the final victorious shot has been fired. The heavy, suffocating tension evaporated, replaced by a profound, radiant peace. I let out a long, shuddering breath and leaned my head back against the pillows. The intense adrenaline rush finally began to recede, leaving me physically exhausted but spiritually lighter than I had ever felt in my 32 years of existence. Grandpa Elijah walked slowly over to the chair beside my bed and sat down, resting his brass-tipped oak cane against the nightstand. He looked at me, his sharp obsidian eyes shining with an immense unspoken pride. He reached out and gently covered my uninjured hand with his own. "You fought a hard battle today," little lioness Elijah said softly. "I did what I had to do to survive, Grandpa," I replied, squeezing his hand tightly. "They left me no other choice." Elijah nodded slowly, his expression serious and thoughtful. "The hardest choices in life usually involve cutting off the dead weight so the rest of the tree can thrive. You pruned the rot, Nia. Now it is time for you to grow." My private security nurse, who had remained incredibly professional and steadfast throughout the entire ordeal, softly pushed open the door to the adjoining nursery. She stepped out, cradling a tiny, tightly swaddled bundle in her arms. She walked over to the bed and gently lowered Malik into my waiting arm. I looked down at my newborn son. He was sleeping soundly, completely oblivious to the massive war that had just been waged and won to secure his future. His tiny chest rose and fell in a steady, peaceful rhythm. I pressed a gentle kiss to his warm forehead, feeling a fierce, unbreakable wave of maternal love wash over me. I had protected my child. I had secured our legacy. The nightmare was finally over. Exactly 12 months later, the sun streamed brightly through the massive floor-to-ceiling windows of my home office. I sat behind a sprawling mahogany desk, reviewing the quarterly financial reports for my wealth management firm. The numbers staring back at me from the encrypted screen were absolutely spectacular. Free from the constant parasitic financial drain of my parents and my sister, my company had experienced an unprecedented explosion of growth. In just 1 year, my CPA firm had officially doubled its annual revenue. We had expanded our operations, brought on a dozen new high-net-worth clients, and secured a lucrative international consulting contract that solidified our position as an industry leader. My physical healing was also complete. The horrific bruising from the car crash had faded entirely. My fractured collarbone had healed perfectly, leaving behind only a faint silvery scar that I viewed as a badge of honor. I was stronger, faster, and infinitely more focused than I had ever been before. I tapped the screen of my tablet, signing off on a major corporate acquisition, and leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair. I looked around the expansive, beautifully decorated office. I was sitting inside the massive, luxurious suburban mansion that Calvin and Valerie had previously called their own. Grandpa Elijah had stayed entirely true to his word. 30 days after the hospital confrontation, my parents were officially and legally evicted from the property. Elijah had immediately transferred the deed of the sprawling estate into an ironclad, irrevocable trust specifically designated for Malik. Since Malik was a minor, I was named the sole executor and primary resident of the property. I had completely redecorated the mansion, stripping away Valerie's gaudy, pretentious high society aesthetic and replacing it with warm, inviting, and comfortable spaces. It was no longer a hollow showpiece used to impress shallow church friends. It was a real home. Grandpa Elijah had moved into the fully renovated guest wing on the first floor, deciding he wanted to spend his remaining years watching his great-grandson grow up. His presence brought a powerful grounding energy to the house, a daily reminder of strength, integrity, and genuine family loyalty. The people who had previously occupied this space were currently living a very different reality. Darius Vance had not been able to charm his way out of federal custody. The forensic evidence I provided to the FBI, combined with the detailed list of defrauded investors, created an airtight case that his expensive defense attorneys could not dismantle. He was found guilty on multiple felony counts of wire fraud, grand larceny, and conspiracy. He was currently serving a mandatory 15-year sentence in a medium-security federal penitentiary. His bespoke suits had been replaced by a standard-issue khaki uniform, and his venture capitalist persona had been completely eradicated by the harsh reality of prison life. Jasmine had lost absolutely everything. When the federal authorities froze Darius's assets and seized their bank accounts to pay restitution to the victims, my sister was left entirely destitute. Her luxury sports cars were repossessed. Her designer handbags and expensive jewelry were auctioned off by the state. Stripped of her fake wealth and abandoned by her superficial social circle, Jasmine had been forced to face the real world. I had recently heard through the grapevine that she was currently working a minimum-wage retail job at the exact same high-end shopping mall where she used to spend thousands of dollars a week. She spent her days folding clothes for the very women she used to look down upon. Calvin and Valerie had suffered a similarly spectacular fall from grace. After being evicted from the mansion, they had scrambled to find housing. With no savings, ruined credit, and their financial lifeline permanently severed, they were forced to rent a cramped, outdated one-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. Their most devastating punishment, however, was the complete and total loss of their social standing. The moment Darius was arrested and the details of the massive Ponzi scheme became public knowledge, Pastor Williams and the entire megachurch congregation turned their backs on my parents. The church members who had lost their life savings in the fraud demanded accountability. Calvin was stripped of his position as a prominent church elder. Valerie was ousted from her charity committees. They were publicly shunned, completely ostracized by the community they had spent decades trying to impress. They were pariahs living out their days in a tiny apartment, entirely isolated and consumed by their own bitter regrets. I closed my tablet and stood up from my desk. I walked out of the home office and made my way down the wide, sunlit hallway toward the expansive backyard. I stepped out onto the marble patio. The warm summer breeze rustled the leaves of the old oak trees lining the property. In the center of the manicured lawn, Grandpa Elijah was sitting on a wooden bench leaning on his brass-tipped cane. He was smiling broadly, tossing a bright red rubber ball across the grass. Malik, now a sturdy, incredibly energetic 1-year-old, let out a joyful, bubbling laugh as he chased after the bouncing ball. He stumbled slightly on his chubby legs, righted himself with determination, and scooped up the toy, turning to flash a brilliant, gap-toothed smile at his great-grandfather. I walked across the patio and stepped onto the soft grass, moving to stand beside Elijah. Malik saw me and immediately abandoned the ball, running across the lawn with his arms outstretched. I knelt down and caught him, scooping him up into my arms and spinning him around as he squealed with absolute delight. I held him tightly against my chest, burying my face in his soft curls, inhaling the sweet powdery scent of my child. Elijah reached over and patted my shoulder, his dark eyes taking in the beautiful, peaceful scene. "We built a good life here, Nia," he said quietly. I looked at the formidable patriarch, and then I looked down at the amazing, healthy boy in my arms. I thought about the brutal trial I had endured in that hospital room, the agonizing betrayal of the people who were supposed to protect me, and the massive smoking ruins of the lies they had built. I had lost my parents and my sister, but I had not lost my family. "We did, Grandpa," I replied, a profound, unshakable peace settling deep into my bones. I hugged Malik closer, feeling the steady, reassuring beat of his heart against mine. I had finally learned the greatest, most important lesson of my life. True family is never defined by shared DNA, a common last name, or the shallow obligations of blood. True family is about who stands beside you when the walls are closing in. True family is about who protects your peace, who fights for your safety, and who loves you enough to burn down the lies so the truth can finally thrive. We were standing on the ashes of their extortion, and our foundation had never been stronger.